Live from Joe Louis Arena in Detroit, Michigan, NBC News reports the 1980 Republican National Convention. Now, reporting from the NBC News Convention Center in Joe Louis Arena, here are David Brinkley and John Chancellor.
And welcome to the final session of the 1980 Republican Convention. The squabbles are over. Unity now prevails in the Republican Party. Their ticket is chosen, and tonight we will hear the acceptance speeches and the balloting, the call of the role of the states for vice president. Everything bad, we presume, is over. David?
Well, we certainly hope. This is the last session, of course. Harold Stassen has lost again. The convention is somewhat staggered and still reeling from the confusing events of last night. We have some new information about what happened and why it happened, which we will bring you during the course of the evening. And it is, shall I say, from the horse's mouth, John?
Yes, I think.
All right, fine. You will be seeing and hearing that later. And finally, we have found out exactly what happened and why. We are going to go down to our intrepid and splendid reporters on the floor. If you saw what they did last night, you must admire them as much as we do. They kept it straight all night and never got off the track, never had any phony information. Beginning with Garrick Utley. Garrick?
Yes, David, here we are again, gluttons for punishment. And the one question mark hanging over tonight's session was whether there would be a revolt by the more conservative Republican delegates protesting the selection of George Bush as Ronald Reagan's running mate. The center of that revolt would have been here in the North Carolina delegation, led by Senator Jesse Helms. He's been saying throughout this convention that if Bush were the choice, that he would place his own name in nomination as a protest. Well, today there's been a lot of back and forth negotiating between Helms's forces and the Reagan camp. Reagan and Helms spoke by telephone at least once, personally, to try to settle the issue. It appears a deal has been made. Reagan has invited Senator Helms to speak in about 40 minutes from now on the podium to address the convention, to speak his mind, say his piece, and it's believed that he will get up, perhaps take exception to the Bush nomination, but agree not to place his name in nomination so that there is at least the symbol of party unity tonight. That doesn't mean that the Bush forces are going to, the anti-Bush forces are going to be happy about it, but they seem prepared to go along when the roll call vote comes to give Ronald Reagan the unity which he is asking for after what happened last night. We'll be following that down here in the North Carolina delegation. Now over to Chris Wallace.
There's opposition to George Bush in several states in the South and West. Delegates who feel that Bush is too liberal, too much a part of the Eastern establishment. Some of those delegates have joined up with Jesse Helms, but the anti-Bush movement never really got going today. One reason is that the Reagan organization has been watching the situation very closely all day. A task force led by Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah telling delegates that Bush really isn't that liberal and that this is no time to embarrass Governor Reagan. The Reagan people doubt that even if Helms goes ahead with this challenge, he can get the support of 6 states to place his name in nomination. And even if he does, they count no more than 250 votes for him here on the floor. Put simply, they say that the so-called Helms challenge is firmly under control. Now to Tom Pettit.
Chris, it appears that the whole Ford maneuver had something to do with Bush and his acceptability to the very conservative delegates of this convention. This is not to say it was a charade, but I was talking this morning with Ed Meese, Reagan's chief of staff, and Bill Casey, his campaign manager, and discussing what the Ford maneuver did for them. Even though Ford decided not to go on the ticket, it did this. It demonstrated to the ultra-conservatives here that they had tried very, very hard to get Ford, the man in the party most acceptable to all wings here at this convention. So they feel that there was some good fallout from the procedure with Ford, even though they didn't get him. They did persuade the delegates, or they think they persuaded the delegates, that they tried as hard as they could, and that the second best man for them, they thought, was Bush. It's all part of a selling job, and it appears as if it is selling. Now to Tom Brokaw.
Thomas, as you know, Republicans of all stripes today, even some prominent Republicans who were out on a limb last night saying that the Reagan-Ford deal had been struck or was very close to it. Well, today they're gamely trying to put the best face on things, hoping that their embarrassment and the confusion of last night will fade very quickly. One well-known student of the GOP said, after all, it could have been much worse. Someone else, very close to Ronald Reagan, said, look, on reflection, we had to end it in a hurry because it was beginning to grow out of control. And what would it look like to the rest of the country if it appeared that Ronald Reagan was negotiating the presidency, giving up bits and pieces of the Oval Office? So all in all, they think that they can confine the damage. Still, one extremely well-known Republican Party strategist said the lasting damage may be that the biggest charge that the Democrats will make against Ronald Reagan is that he is a simplistic man who cannot deal with a complicated situation. And he begins his campaign by dealing with a complicated situation in a simplistic way. And now to the booth.
Thank you, Tom, gentlemen. And we're now going to go to the podium where Jessica Savage has a report for us on what's going to be taking place here this evening. Jessica?
John, what could be happening, or what is happening right now, is about to have a call to order. John Rhodes coming out to take the gavel. And what could happen here tonight is something that we were talking about a little bit earlier. Jesse Helms getting up to speak, or Jesse Helms being nominated for vice president. Around the Senate, Jesse Helms is known as a master parliamentarian. He knows how to use the rules to his own advantage. He may well do that here tonight. It takes a majority of 5 states to nominate a president. But anybody in this room can get up and nominate anybody else in this country to be vice president of the United States. Does Helms know that? Yes. Does he also know there could be demonstrations? He knows that too. What he wants to do is get an opportunity to take the floor and express his conservative, even for this convention, very conservative views. In fact, earlier this afternoon, we talked with Senator Helms and asked him, what do you want to do about this? You're not going to be vice president. Why bother? And he said, I don't know what we would accomplish, except that we could express our views and express the views of those who have supported Ronald Reagan throughout the years who, frankly, are dissatisfied with George Bush. That's what might happen here on the podium tonight. Back to the booth.
During the day, Ronald Reagan and George Bush have been busy all over town. They held a press conference together earlier today. They have been doing all kinds of things, which we're going to catch up on now, beginning with Heidi Schulman, who is at the Detroit Plaza Hotel. Heidi?
David, Ronald Reagan is now back in his hotel suite at the Detroit Plaza Hotel, but this morning, after he met with George Bush and talked with reporters about his vice presidential selection process, Reagan decided he needed some time to get away from it all, to get a little bit of privacy. So he drove 25 miles from here to the comfortable suburb of Bloomfield Hills and the home of William Agee, who's chairman of the board of the Bendix Corporation. There in the den of the Agee home, Reagan practiced the speech that he will give tonight to the convention using a teleprompter, just like the one used in the Joe Louis Arena. His wife Nancy joined him there later in the afternoon, and at one point Reagan took a break from his work and took a 10-minute stroll around the neighborhood, shook a few hands of neighbors out there. He then came back to the hotel. We're told he will dine privately in his suite tonight with his family, and is expected to leave the hotel at about 9 o'clock to go over to Joe Louis Arena. There he will listen to George Bush's acceptance speech, and then he'll deliver his own. David Burrington has been following George Bush today and has a report on his day from the Pontchartrain Hotel.
This is one of the first days since Bush arrived in town that he's not been able to sneak away and do some jogging during his breakfast and luncheon meetings with Reagan. One assumes that they talked about a lot of things, and among them, all the behind-the-scenes maneuvering last night, which led to Bush's selection, but as second choice. That's not a subject that Bush cares much to talk about, saying that it's no problem. The two men also discussed the differences that arose between them during the primary campaigns. Bush said that he also would like to de-emphasize that, saying they'll stress the common ground. This afternoon, Bush has been working on his acceptance speech, and right now he's over at the convention hall, supposedly doing some rehearsing. That's about it, except to say that George Bush had the appearance today of being the happiest man in Detroit. David?
Thank you, David.
That's all.
There is, as you have heard from our reporters, some, not a whole lot, objection here to George Bush on grounds that some of these Republicans here think he is a liberal. I don't know how that was arrived at. Apparently, they think anybody who wears a Brooks Brothers suit and does not know how to tie a tie is a liberal.
He doesn't know how to tie a tie?
No, they're always crooked.
You have funny prejudices.
They look at George Bush the next time you see him.
Well, he's very conservative.
Yes.
He is. The one thing I think that did get some people upset with him is that he doesn't share this party's platform of view on a constitutional amendment against abortion, and he is in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment. But apart from that,
he doesn't like the way Reagan talks of cutting taxes.
But aside from that, to list him as a liberal is totally wrong. In fact, when George Bush began running in the primaries, to no one's surprise, because there are a lot of conservative Republicans who vote in Republican primaries, he became more conservative than he had been before.
Well, I remember it might have been in Iowa, in the very first caucus in January. You were talking to him. I was in New York. You were in Iowa that night. And you said to him, you're at least as conservative as Reagan. And he said, yes.
Absolutely.
Or perhaps more so.
Yeah.
And he is.
So that the opposition to him, I confess, is a little bit of a puzzle to us.
Do you think it might be a regional prejudice as much as anything else? Cultural, regional?
Cultural, I think, is a better word than regional, myself. Earlier today, to resume the proceedings here, I interviewed Gerald Ford about the events of yesterday. Somebody may write a book about that, and certainly a chapter will be written about the fact that President Ford spent much of the day considering an offer made to him by Ronald Reagan to run for vice president. Ford's position was that while he didn't want to tamper with the authority of the presidency itself at all, what he was interested in was enlarging the scope and responsibilities of the office of vice president. And so, after spending the day in consideration, last night at about 11 o'clock, he went downstairs in the hotel, one flight, walked down the stairs, and told Ronald Reagan what Mr. Ford's final decision was. And we'd like to play that part of the tape for you now. Here's Gerald Ford talking about meeting Reagan.
I went down to see him about 11:15.
Got in the elevator here, rode down.
No, I walked down.
You walked down the stairs?
One stair.
And you went in and saw him, and may I ask, sir, what did you say to him?
I said, Governor, despite all our efforts and despite the forthcoming attitude you've had, I must say that in my judgment, my original conclusion was right, and I ask you not to consider me as your running mate.
And what was his response?
He said, Jerry, I respect your decision. I reiterated my support. It was a very short meeting, but that's about the sum and substance of it.
I confess to being a little puzzled, and I'm not trying to hector you, believe me, I'm not, but around 9:30 you felt that it probably wouldn't work, and you thought about it for an hour and a half, and came to that. Did anybody come in with other offers, or is there any other element that I don't know about?
I would recollect, or I believe I am accurate, that the staffs were still trying to do something.
And they'd go to see Governor Reagan, and they'd come up to see you?
I don't know what his staff did with him, but I can tell you that my staff was meeting with some of his people, and they would report back to me, and the more the details seemed to focus on the actuality of considering a problem or a policy, the more dubious I became.
Could this arrangement with Governor Reagan have been brought about if they had started talking to you, or your staff and his staff had started talking, say, 2 or 3 days earlier?
It might have. It might have. But I don't want to create the wrong impression that there was any negligence on their part or negligence on my part. It might have if we'd had more time. But conventions, you know, are the most disorganized gatherings of people every 4 years in the history of this country.
And this one last night is going to be up to the top of that list.
Well, there was no fault, no negligence. I'm just saying, if there'd been more time, it might have worked out.
So really what we're dealing with here is a sort of accident of history, aren't we? I mean, if it had started earlier, it might have happened.
But I may I conclude my observations with this? When Betty and I came to this convention on Saturday, we came, one, not seeking any office. We came to reaffirm our support for Governor Reagan, and we came to at least tilt our recommendations for George Bush. I wasn't condemning any of the others, but for reasons I believed he would be the best on the ticket. We leave Detroit exactly the way we planned we would come. We didn't want an office, we don't have one. We reaffirmed our support for Governor Reagan, and with pride and with conviction, and we may have helped, I don't know, in getting the ticket as it is.
You look like a happy man to me, Mr. President.
I am, John.
He's extraordinary. At age 67, he looks 10 years younger. He's in wonderful shape, and I think he really is leaving here a happy man, with one possible exception, and that is that there's a lot of the old warhorse, the political warhorse in Jerry Ford, and I think when he hears the bell ringing, he wants to go sometimes.
Well, the bell rang in his hall the other night. He turned them on as no one has since.
And that has to be a very heady experience, almost narcotic, I think, for somebody in politics.
Well, it must have got to him, because he's been making political speeches by the dozens, by the hundreds, if not the thousands, for years.
We are going, that interview ran about 25 minutes this afternoon. You saw just a minute or two of it here. During the evening, we are going to be showing other parts in which he talks about the actual negotiations that he and the Reagan campaign had. He talks about how all of this started back in Palm Springs last month, when Ronald Reagan, having won all the primaries he needed for this nomination, came and called on Mr. Ford at Mr. Ford's home in Palm Springs and offered him the nomination for vice president. Ford at that time said no. He tells that whole story, and we'll be having that in little pieces this evening. David?
Since it didn't work out with Jerry Ford, Ronald Reagan, of course, as you know, picked George Bush to run with him for vice president. Our NBC poll, it isn't so much a poll as a count. I mean, we didn't ask a small sample. We asked nearly all of the delegates down here who they liked for vice president, and the great majority said Bush. Nevertheless, there are a number of opponents, some bitter enders here, who don't like him, don't want him, and so on. We're going to hear a little about that from our reporters on the floor now, beginning with Chris Wallace. Chris?
Ernie Angelo is the chairman of the delegation from Texas, George Bush's home state. And I understand, Mr. Angelo, that there is some mixed reaction here to the selection of Texas's favorite son.
We had some disappointed delegates. They were strongly supporting other candidates, and I'm not sure whether they've gotten over their disappointment yet or not, but I'm sure that they will.
What don't they like about George Bush?
Well, I think more than anything, it's that they like someone else better. And they've all, however, committed 100% to support the ticket in the fall, and that's really what counts.
Are there some feelings, though, that Bush is too liberal, too much a part of the Eastern establishment?
I think there's some of that feeling. I honestly believe that Ambassador Bush has been falsely caricatured there as on the liberal side of things, much more so than is deserved.
Who would your delegation like to have seen chosen?
The majority of them indicated a preference for Jack Kemp.
Do you think that Bush will help the ticket in Texas?
I think we'll do quite well with George on the ticket, and I expect that we'll be able to carry the state, and he ought to help us substantially in other races in the state.
Ernie Angelo giving us the picture in Texas. Now to Tom Brokaw.
And in Illinois, State Representative Susan Catania, an Anderson delegate, you said what? That if it had been Ford on the ticket, you would have gone with Ronald Reagan?
If it had been Ford on the ticket and he had said what he's led us to believe that he thinks, that is that ERA ought to be ratified and that 3 Mile Island does not prove that nuclear
reactors. Can we come back to you? Because guess what? Our candle just went out here.
They turned the lights out again.
I wondered what kind of magic you were going to work to make that work.
All right, well, let's go back up to the booth.
You're back up in the booth.
The Republicans are showing one of their selected short subjects. Every once in a while during the program, they slide down a screen, big screen over the podium, and show a movie for, what, 30, 40 seconds?
You want to look at it?
Well,
yes, let's have a look at it. This is a film on
Republican Party.
Who are the delegates?
My name is George Rios. I'm from New York State. I'm here because I believe Hispanics must participate more actively in the political process of this country. I'm also here because we lack leadership in Washington and we need an alternative. I'm convinced that that alternative is Governor Reagan.
My name is Jack Sanderson. I'm a farmer, vocational agriculture teacher from Fremont, Michigan. I'm here because of the farm policy, Carter's farm policy. He ought to know better. He is a farmer.
My name is Juan Rangel. I'm a delegate from Laredo, Texas, and I'm here because I'm concerned about America. I'm concerned about the economy, the high inflation rate, the high unemployment rate, the lack of a comprehensive energy program, and I'm also concerned about our foreign policy, the lack of consistency, and I think Ronald Reagan is the individual, the man that will provide the leadership in the White House to solve these and many other problems.
We're proud of you, America. That's what we're about.
That's the end of the movie. They've shown a number of them. They are very effective for party purposes, but a little short on drama, romance, and suspense.
I
Wouldn't
thought
you say?
faintly partisan.
You would?
Yes.
No. Tom Brokaw was talking, and the lights went out. The lights are back on. Tom?
State representative from the south side of Chicago in the state of Illinois, came here as an Anderson representative, and last night began to think that maybe she could vote for Ronald Reagan if he had Gerald Ford on the ticket.
I was a Ford delegate in '76, and I think that Jerry Ford believes in the Equal Rights Amendment, that he understands the problems of cities, and that he might have said that the platform was not all that good. However, last night, Governor Reagan said George Bush supports the platform across the board, and that platform is not what the majority of the American people want.
But the fact is, you really are in a minority of a minority here, aren't you, as an Anderson delegate, probably not going for this ticket.
I certainly am in a minority.
Well, what do you think will happen this fall in Illinois with John Anderson contesting the likes of Ronald Reagan and George Bush?
I think moderate Republicans have no place to go but to John Anderson. However, since he's running as an independent, he has to have a superb national campaign if he's to have a chance at winning, even in his home state, Illinois.
And yet he didn't do all that well against Ronald Reagan in the primary there.
No, but that was only Republicans voting. This time it's wide open.
All right, thank you very much, Susan Catania. Now let's go to Tom Pettit.
Ohio State Representative Bill Batchelder is upset about George Bush. What are you going to do about it?
Well, I'm not really sure what we do about it at this point. I think our reservations really just turn on 2 points at this time. The first one is the economic plank in the platform, how important it is. It's really the centerpiece. It's what all of our people have been talking about.
You're talking about the 30% tax cut.
I'm talking about Kemp Roth in some form, that's right. And in the end of his campaign, of course, Ambassador Bush expressed very strong reservations about that plank.
What's the other one?
Well, I think really the other one has to do with foreign policy and his identification with some of the more soft aspects of the Ford foreign policy.
You wanted Ford instead of Bush?
Yes, I think he gave us a lot of strength on the ticket, and really largely political motives.
Mr. Batchelder, you think that Bush's presence on the ticket will hurt it in Ohio?
Oh, it's very difficult to tell because it'll help it in some areas where you have enclaves of people who are more well-to-do and so forth. I think it'll be very strong.
You would have been part of the Helms movement here tonight, would you not? Had you had a
yeah,
chance?
I would have supported Jess Helms, sure.
Really? What happened to that? How was that squashed?
Well, I think what happened was there was a realization that this is what Governor Reagan wants, and Senator Helms, I think, wanted to accommodate that.
And he agreed to give a little speech.
I understand he's going to say a few words, that's right.
Bill Batchelder of Ohio. To Garrick Utley.
Standing here with Tom Ellis in the North Carolina delegation. Mr. Ellis, a principal aide to Senator Jesse Helms. Tom Ellis, you're wearing a Stop Stassen button. Okay, you've stopped Harold Stassen. You haven't stopped George Bush. Why don't you and conservative Republicans like you like George Bush? Bush says he's as conservative as Ronald Reagan.
Well, I think that is the big part of it. Certainly he doesn't share the same philosophy as Ronald Reagan and he's made those views clear throughout the campaign.
But today he says he can share it. He can run on this party platform, which has been adopted by... What is it specifically?
Well, you know, the only thing you can tell about somebody is what their past record has been, and up until this point he has not been a conservative. Now maybe he changes stripes, I don't know.
What makes a conservative?
Well, one that shares the views that Ronald Reagan has been espousing over the years.
But if George Bush says he accepts the Reagan platform...
Well, you know, It's easy to say that. It's another thing to do it. And all we can do is go on a man's past performances.
But there's nothing specific that you can offer as to why you don't like George Bush, whereas you would love to have had Gerald Ford, and Gerald Ford was promoting George Bush.
I don't believe I said I'd love to have Gerald Ford. What we were looking for was somebody that was a philosophic conservative, a Paul Laxalt or Jack Kemp or a Jesse Helms.
But when the vote comes tonight, do you think you could vote for George Bush if Senator Helms says he supports that?
Well, I reckon we will if he says so, but it'll go down mighty hard.
We'll know soon enough. Thank you very much, Tom Ellis. Now back up to David Brinkley.
Well, there is a contrary view on this, and it comes from Bob Dole, Senator Bob Dole, who knows a little something about how elections are won and something about how they're lost. His view is that he likes George Bush, will vote for him, he's glad he's on the ticket, but he has a small problem in the fact that he finds him to be too conservative. He said he would have preferred somebody of more moderate, not liberal, moderate views, somewhat to balance the Reagan conservatism and to help make the party appealing to a broader spectrum of people. So that, as I say, is from one of the senior vestrymen and wardens of the party, serves in the Senate, has run for vice president himself, knows something about it. That's his view. Tonight, of course, we will have the acceptance speech by Ronald Reagan. We will have George Bush's name placed in nomination for vice president, and he will be elected. Be nominated. We might point out that in our poll of the delegates here in the hall, the majority of them were in favor of Bush, and so these objections to him come from a minority. Jessica Savage on the podium has some information about what's going to happen tonight. Jessica?
David, I have some information on some vice presidential nominations. All of the names that you heard mentioned as vice presidential possibilities may well be nominated tonight. Under the rules of this convention, it takes no majority to make a vice presidential nomination. There's no seconding required, and so anybody can nominate anybody, and frequently does. It applies to both parties in this case, so it's made for some very interesting vice presidential nominations over the years. Back in 1956 at the GOP convention, there was a commotion called by a Nebraska delegate who attempted to nominate Joe Smith, and it turned out there was no Joe Smith, so the chairman said, take Joe Smith and get out. Then in 1976, a Republican delegate nominated Roger Staubach, and in that year, a Democrat nominated Fritz Efall, who was a draft evader. But the biggest year for this kind of off-the-wall vice presidential nomination was in 1972. It kind of symbolized the chaos of the Democratic Party in that year. These names were placed in nomination: Archie Bunker, Martha Mitchell, whose husband was a Republican Attorney General, a Mississippi newspaper man who later went on to become State Department spokesman by the name of Hodding Carter III, and a network correspondent by the name of Roger Mudd. Well, not to be outdone, the Republicans in 1972 nominated a network anchorman. David Brinkley turned the job down. David?
Jessica, that was the start of a less than brilliant political career. Agnew got, if I remember rightly, got 1,485 votes. I got 1. It wasn't a good second, but it was second. Nightly News will be along next, and after Nightly News at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, we'll return to the convention coverage with a lot of information about what happened last night. In the meantime, we'll be back shortly.
Now join Decision 80, NBC's coverage of the GOP National Convention, already in progress.
But we're going to continue now with our special coverage, including exclusive interviews with an interview with President Gerald Ford on what happened yesterday, how Ford came close to accepting Ronald Reagan's offer to run on the ticket and then declining that in a meeting that took place last night around 11 o'clock. This sequence of the story begins at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon when Mr. Ford was in his suite on the 70th floor of the Detroit Plaza Hotel, about a half a mile from the convention hall, and on the floor immediately below was Ronald Reagan's suite on the 69th floor. At this point, the staffs of Reagan and Ford were meeting and discussing how the powers of the vice presidency could be enlarged enough so that Mr. Ford would think it meaningful enough to accept a place on the ticket in the hopes that he could be something quite special in American history, a sort of super enlarged vice president. So let's pick it up now with what Gerald Ford told me today about the chronology of these events about 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Did you have another meeting with the governor around 5 o'clock in the afternoon yesterday?
Yes, right.
A brief meeting.
Very brief.
Can you tell us where it stood at that point?
Well, we were, through our representatives, working on the problems of the administrative organization, and we talked in general. And our impressions, both of us, were that that was a possibility.
So at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it was still on the track. Were people drawing lines on charts?
No, they didn't. They weren't at that point, but they were discussing words and responsibilities and so forth. And the best, I must say, everybody was forthcoming. Everybody was doing an excellent job in the right spirit.
Well, both sides wanted it.
That's right.
Would a letter have been sent or anything like that? Would you have had to sign anything in this?
I don't think we would have had to make it that formal, John. I repeat what I said a moment ago. If Governor Reagan and I had agreed on what our staffs had worked out, I would have trusted him, and obviously I think he would have trusted me.
All right, now we're getting to the most interesting part of the story. From 5 o'clock in the afternoon until 11 o'clock at night, 6 hours. The breakdown or the realization that it couldn't be done came in that time period. When did you realize that this had happened?
Well, I guess somewhere around 9:30 or thereabouts. The people who had been working with me, they had had several other meetings with representatives from Governor Reagan, and we started to try and say, here's a problem, how would it work? Mm-hmm. Here's another problem, how would it work? And when you moved each step toward the decision, the final decision by the president, we could see that even with the best of goodwill, and I'm not just saying Governor Reagan and myself, but all of the staff, the constitutional limitations or prohibitions or restrictions, whatever you want to call them, that established the office of president and vice president, got involved in a roadblock somehow. Mm-hmm. And I will say this, John, from the outset, I had a feeling that my political instincts told me that this was a great idea on paper, but from my own experience in the vice presidency and the presidency, it had many, many roadblocks down the way. And by 9:30, 10 o'clock or thereabouts, those fears or apprehensions began to mount.
And at 11 o'clock last night, about an hour and a half after those fears and apprehensions began to mount in Mr. Ford's mind, he walked down the one flight of stairs to Ronald Reagan's suite and said, sorry, it's off. And this convention had been waiting 6 hours, 5 hours, for quite a different announcement. And we're going to go down to the floor now and pick up the progress of this convention. Senator Robert Dole is now nominating for the post of Vice President George Bush.
Men and women who deserve to serve. One of those is the man that I'm honored to nominate tonight. I know him well. We have shared experiences, having served in the Congress together and having both held the position as chairman of the Republican National Committee. But I really got to know him better this past year I got to see him close up, watching as his character was forged and shaped on the crucible that is our presidential selection process. I watched as he reached out to Hispanics in Puerto Rico, farmers in Iowa, auto workers in Michigan, and engineers in Massachusetts. I watched and I thought, here is a man who understands what this party must do to become what it must become, the majority party in this nation. As a young man, he saw the flames of war spread across the globe and enlisted in the armed forces. His services as a pilot earned him many decorations for heroism in the Pacific. In his 20s, he went to Texas with Barbara, a great asset in this campaign. And there he built a successful business from the ground up. In his 30s, he ran and won a seat in Congress in a district that had never before elected a Republican. And once again, he left his mark, becoming a valued member of the House Ways and Means Committee. In his 40s, he began a second career in public service in the executive branch of our government, where he served with exceptional skill as our American ambassador to the United Nations, as American envoy to China, and as director of Central Intelligence. Along the way, he even squeezed in a term as a very successful chairman of our party in a very difficult time for the Republican Party. And now tonight, in his 50s, he embarks upon a new journey to become the next Vice President of the United States. The record, ladies and gentlemen, is long and distinguished. Yet the true mark of leader lies not in the titles he has held, but the vision and hope he has inspired. And let me also say, he ran a positive campaign, an uplifting campaign, the kind of campaign that will be a vital asset in helping to ensure that Ronald Reagan is the next President of the United States. Experience, honor, vision. These are the qualities that he will bring to our ticket. And upon these foundations, all of us can help to make the next president of our land, Ronald Reagan, one of the greatest presidents of our history. And he will stand with Ronald Reagan, and together they will fight to throw off the gloom and despair that has descended over our beloved country. We can win this election by two ways, my fellow Republicans and my fellow Americans who may be watching. We can win it as a rejection of Jimmy Carter and all the mistakes we have come to associate with his administration. Or we can win it on our own by offering a positive alternative that promotes greater prosperity, greater employment, greater national security, and a more compassionate way of helping those who want nothing more from life than a chance to join in the competition that is the American birthright. Whether we win is up to the American people. Whether we deserve to win is up to ourselves. And the man I am about to nominate will help ensure that we deserve to win that victory. He is a man of vision. He is dedicated to making America, America again. We are not faced simply with an election in 1980. We are faced with a referendum on the American way of life. We're literally voting on our futures and on the kind of world we envision for ourselves and our children as we move into the 21st century. I believe this man can build a better world, just as he has built upon each of his varied experiences to move from success to success. And let me say one personal word. I say to the delegates and to the alternates and to the guests in this chamber, I say to those who may have supported other candidates for vice president, I say to those who may have been other candidates for president, This man deserves our nomination as vice president. This man has earned that right. This man has your philosophy. And let's make no mistake about it. Some of us have tried and failed. Some in this audience have tried and succeeded. This is not a time to stress our differences. This is a time to stress agreement, to talk about the unity in our party. And so I say, with all the sincerity I can muster, it is my honor, it is my privilege to nominate the next Vice President of the United States, George Bush.
Senator Dole ran against Bush in a number of the primaries this year, got soundly trounced by Reagan in most of them, not by Bush.
He dropped out fairly early.
He did. And again, in this interesting and curious convention, Bob Dole was one of the ones who was working hardest yesterday to get Gerald Ford to agree to go on the ticket. So this speech tonight that he's just given would have been given on behalf of Gerald Ford if he'd succeeded.
With a slight rewriting, he could have used the same speech. We'll be back in a moment. We're back in the convention hall where there's a demonstration in progress for George Bush, who has been put in nomination by Senator Robert Dole. Our understanding now is that that is the only name to be put in. There are a few seconding speeches, and that will be that. In the meantime, on our discussion of the events of last evening, the decision that by Gerald Ford that he would not run with Ronald Reagan for vice president and the attendant complexities, we will have more on that shortly. But in the meantime, we're going down to the floor to Tom Brokaw, who is talking with Jim Brady about this. He is of the Ronald Reagan staff. Tom?
Jim Brady is a top hand, as we call them. You got a fancy long title, Director of Public Affairs or something like that?
Yeah, that's right, Tom.
All right, but a top hand, close to the situation in the Reagan campaign. We were just listening to former President Ford describing the situation as all being very low-key and very civilized, and then just suddenly there was a realization that this was not going to work out. On the other hand, we've heard from various admirers and supporters and people close to the Reagan camp that the price became too high, that former President Ford, through his negotiators Kissinger and Greenspan, was simply asking too much. Which was it?
Well, Tom, I think it could best be characterized that as you know, and publicly President Ford said, it's something he'd been negative on all along. It was something that was worth trying. It was unique. It would have been an asset a unique asset to have a former president in that slot, and the two men had some 4 face-to-face meetings back and forth, and President Ford came down last evening after 11 o'clock and said that he thought he could best serve by being on the outside, staying on the outside, campaigning for Reagan, campaigning for the whole team.
Because that was it clear to him at that time that you were going to not give up what they were asking?
Well, I don't think it's so much that, you know, the presidency is not something you can negotiate. There's only one president. There can't be 4 hands on the wheel. And I think that's basically it.
How in the world did you get so many of your top political hands on this floor involved in the feeling that the deal had been struck? We were just talking about it a moment ago. Governors Ray of Iowa and Thompson of Illinois thought that there was a deal made. You were saying Bill Timmons, who runs your political operation here, had people coming up to him and saying it's all over, the deal has been made. How did you let that get out of hand?
Well, it'd be pretty hard to control. Last night someone said there should have been better communications with the floor, but in a situation that fluid, And when people have other assignments on the floor, you really can't do it on a moment-to-moment negotiation basis.
Jim, why didn't Ronald Reagan just go to Gerald Ford and said, look, Mr. Ford, can we make a deal here? And let's just you and I, for about 2 minutes, talk over the possibility of some conditions that we might be able to get together on and get it resolved that way and do it quickly before it became so public and so confusing.
Well, it's certainly reached a level of public awareness, I think beyond either camp's ability to predict.
Jim Brady, Director of Public Affairs, as we say, one of the top hands. This is a real live insider, folks. You're seeing it right here on our air. And now to Gary Gutlett.
In the Florida delegation with Tommy Thomas, Reagan's campaign chairman in Florida and the head of the delegation. Mr. Thomas, last night the conventional wisdom and the common enthusiasm was that Reagan-Ford was the ideal ticket. But do you think that was ever a real possibility? A workable possibility?
Well, it might have been a possibility of a ticket, but it would have been a very poor marriage. I don't think it would have been a practical answer at all. It just wouldn't work.
Why wouldn't it work?
Well, this country's not ready for co-presidents. I think that President Ford would constantly have been upstaging President Reagan, and it was just not a practical solution at all.
Among these 2,000 delegates, sir, you are about the first one who has said this, who had said that it just, in practice, wouldn't work during the campaign or in an administration.
Well, I'm a businessman, and the buck has got to stop somewhere. There can only be one boss. There can't be somebody standing around behind you, second-guessing you, and you make a statement in the morning, and he contradicts in the afternoon. If we think we've got chaos with Carter and Mondale, that would have almost been as bad, and I can't imagine anybody being worse than Carter and Mondale, but that situation would have been unworkable.
Tommy Thomas of Florida, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now back up to John Chancellor.
Picking up our narrative of what happened yesterday, there were some wonderful little scenes that took place here, and we didn't know anything about them. But, for example, last night at around, I suppose, 10 or 11 o'clock, Senator Dole, whom you just saw, nominating George Bush, began to get worried that something was wrong, that the deal was not on with Gerald Ford. And he and Howard Baker, in this tumultuous convention that was going on here, he and Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee left the hall, ran outside, trying to get to the Detroit Plaza Hotel, and Baker's car was gone. So they got over there in a police car. They commandeered a police car, went over to find out what had happened, to talk to Reagan, to talk to Ford, and they got there in time to watch Reagan leaving the hotel on television. There were a million interesting little stories that last night. David, you've got some more on it.
Well, one is, I talked to Henry Kissinger today, who was one of the negotiators, if that's the word, on President Ford's side, if that is the term, and he told us a little about how it was done. It was necessarily done in an extremely confused, disorderly way. Partly because whenever any of them needed to talk to somebody about a point that had been raised, the chances were that A, the elevator was overloaded and you couldn't get it, the phone lines are busy, whoever it was you wanted to talk to was out somewhere holding a press conference. It was next to impossible to get the people together so that anything could be settled and agreed on. And in addition to all of that, none of them had had any sleep. So here is what Henry Kissinger had to say about that in our interview today.
I'm certain if there had been another 24 hours, the outcome would have been different. But all of these discussions were compressed in a time frame between 7 in the morning and midnight by people who had 3 or 4 hours sleep.
He did not ask for any specific appointment or power or control of this or of that?
Knowing President Ford, I would be amazed if he did not express what he's expressing on every television interview, which people he thinks are qualified for high office. But it was that is not including myself. But for that you can see on every television program that includes him. But that was not a condition. It was not the breakdown, and I had personally, on my own authority, told the Reagan group that under no circumstances could that be part of an arrangement because it would be inappropriate I then said the same thing to President Ford, and I know President Ford said the same thing to Governor Reagan. So that and this was 5 hours before the final failure of the discussion. So there was never, that was not an issue. That was not an
meaning President Ford did not ask for the right to make any particular appointments.
That is correct.
That was Henry Kissinger talking about the conditions, physical and otherwise, under which these negotiations about President Ford running for vice president, that is hard to say that, President Ford running for vice president, and how it got to be so difficult. Now, where are we?
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what Henry Kissinger just called the final failure of these negotiations. The final failure came at 11 o'clock last night, and when President Ford told Ronald Reagan that he had decided, and you'll hear him saying that in just a minute, that he has decided not to accept Reagan's offer, that set into motion a number of things. This convention at that hour was in turmoil. Nobody knew what to believe, but most delegates believed that Gerald Ford would be walking into the convention, escorted into it by Ronald Reagan, and they would announce the dream ticket, and the Republicans would go on to win everything from president to dog catcher. But that didn't happen, and now here is Gerald Ford describing that final meeting with Ronald Reagan.
I went down to see him about 11:15.
Got in the elevator here, rode down?
No, I walked down.
You walked down the stairs?
One stair.
And you went in and saw him, and may I ask, sir, what did you say to him?
I said, Governor, despite all our efforts and despite the forthcoming attitude you've had, I must say that in my judgment, my original conclusion was right, and I ask you not to consider me as your running mate.
And what was his response?
He said, Jerry, I respect your decision. I reiterated my support. It was a very short meeting, but that's about the sum and substance of it.
I confess to being a little puzzled, and I'm not trying to hector you, believe me, I'm not, but around 9:30 you felt that it probably wouldn't work, and you thought about it for an hour and a half, and came to that. Did anybody come in with other offers, or is there any other element that I don't know about?
I would recollect, or I believe I am accurate, that the staffs were still trying to do something.
And they'd go to see Governor Reagan, and they'd come up to see you?
I don't know what his staff did with him, but I can tell you that my staff was meeting with some of his people, and they would report back to me, and the more the details seemed to focus on the actuality of considering a problem or a policy, the more dubious I became.
Could this arrangement with Governor Reagan have been brought about if they had started talking to you, or your staff and his staff had started talking, say, 2 or 3 days earlier?
It might have. It might have. But I don't want to create the wrong impression that there was any negligence on their part or negligence on my part. It might have if we'd had more time. But conventions, you know, are the most disorganized gatherings of people every 4 years in the history of this country.
And this one last night is going to be up near the top of that list.
Well, there was no fault, no negligence. I'm just saying, if there'd been more time, it might have worked out.
So really what we're dealing with here is a sort of accident of history, aren't we? I mean, if it had started earlier, it might have happened.
But may I conclude my observations with this? When Betty and I came to this convention on Saturday, we came, one, not seeking any office. We came to reaffirm our support for Governor Reagan, and we came to at least tilt our recommendations for George Bush. I wasn't condemning any of the others, but for reasons I believed he would be the best on the ticket. We leave Detroit exactly the way we planned we would come. We didn't want an office, we don't have one. We reaffirmed our support for Governor Reagan, and with pride and with conviction, and we may have helped, I don't know, in getting the ticket as it is.
You look like a happy man to me, Mr. President.
I am, John.
They'll be talking about this last night's events in the Republican Party for the next 10 or 15 years. And it would have been an interesting historical precedent. No president has ever run for vice president.
We have this week been hearing from Bob Strauss, former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and others talking about the Republicans' doings in Detroit. We're not having him tonight, but he did say in Washington today about the events of last night, well, they made a mess of one. I have done the same thing myself. I think it's a very strong ticket, Reagan and Bush. We'll be back in a moment.
From Joe Louis Arena in Detroit, Michigan, NBC News reports the 1980 Republican National Convention, brought to you in part by McDonnell Douglas, builders of the DC-10, now serving 90 nations, flying 1 million miles a day. Reporting from the NBC News Convention Center in Joe Louis Arena, here is John Chancellor.
Well, all unity and togetherness here in the convention hall tonight as the Republicans finish up their 1980 convention. In a few minutes, we'll have a roll call of states for the selection of a nominee for vice president. And David Brinkley and I think George Bush may just pull that one out and be nominated. After that, we will hear a rousing speech from Mr. Bush, and then the cap of the evening will be Ronald Reagan in his acceptance speech, which for any politician is one of the most important speeches he could ever deliver. David?
George Bush is in nomination. He was nominated by Senator Dole. Now there are some seconding speeches. And even though our polls showed that Bush was the choice of the majority of the delegates on the floor here, there are some hard rock conservatives who are irritated to have him nominated. They behave almost as if Ronald Reagan had chosen Jane Fonda for vice president. However, he's going to win shortly. The roll call will begin shortly. In the meantime, we're going down to the floor to Garrick Utley, who is talking to Congressman Bauman of Maryland. Garrick?
David, one of the reasons the whole process of nominating George Bush is going very smoothly is that Jesse Helms of North Carolina has agreed not to place his name in nomination, representing the more conservative Republicans. And the reason he is not doing that is because of Congressman Bauman and other people. But Congressman Bauman, you were the man who conducted a large part of the discussions, even negotiations between the Helms people and the Reagan forces today to solve this potential dispute. What did it take for Senator Helms and your group to not to cause trouble, not to put Helms' name in nomination?
Well, I don't think we ever intended to cause trouble, but it was a simple realization of the fact that we have worked for years to nominate and to elect President Ronald Reagan. And our conclusion was, particularly Senator Helms, that this was the best way to bring conservatives into the fold who might be disaffected and to help Governor Reagan get elected. So there was no real hard decision.
Did you get any assurances from Ronald Reagan about his conservative policies?
We don't need any assurances from Ronald Reagan, and we got none. But this, the senator's speech, that they would make this speech and take this form of action, was personally approved by Governor Reagan in conversations.
Now, how many votes would Helms have received had he gone for the nomination?
I think if he had been nominated and run, he would have received several hundred votes here. No chance that he would have defeated George Bush, but many delegates are not totally satisfied. And the fact that we were able to stand on that rostrum and Jesse was able to say that George Bush will support the platform in every particular, and there's been a line inserted into his speech tonight to that effect.
You insisted on that line to be...
No one insisted on anything, but it was there. It'll be there.
But the line was offered, let us say.
No, it wasn't offered to us. I just noticed when the speech copies came down tonight, it was there.
I see. Now, but Jesse Helms still will get a few scattered votes on the convention floor.
That's entirely possible. A lot of people have affection for a man who stands on principle as he often does.
Thank you very much. Congressman Bauman of Maryland. Now, back to John Chancellor.
The winner of this year's Brinkley Chancellor Brevity Award is about to appear on your screen. Lowell Thomas Sr. made one of the seconding speeches here tonight for George Bush. He said they have limited us to 2 minutes per speech. He spoke for about half that time. Hooray for Lowell Thomas. He's on the floor with Tom Brokaw now.
Thank you, John. Lowell Thomas is sitting down here in the front of the Michigan delegation. He just asked me how many conventions I had attended, and I told him, and then I said, your first convention was when?
1912 in Chicago. That was the Bull Moose Convention, remember?
You saw Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah. That's when Teddy knocked off his pal, President Taft.
Conventions were a little different in those days than they were in these days.
There were no electronic equipment.
Real smoke-filled rooms.
Yeah. Well, no. A couple thousand people, but not this size. And you had to be a pretty good speaker to get your thoughts across under those things.
Are you a Republican, Mr. Thomas?
Well, many years ago, I had a sponsor in Philadelphia, Sun Oil. And the heads of Sun Oil were the Pews. And they were the principal backers for the Republican Party. And one day when I was paying my respects to them in Philadelphia, someone across the room asked the head of the Pew family what my politics were.
Right.
And he thought a moment. He said, I think Lowell is an anarchist.
How old are you?
I'm in my 89th year.
And you still ski, someone told me.
Yes, I do.
And you're still traveling.
I've just come from Moscow.
Why were you in Moscow? Taking a look at the Olympics, or just doing some of your reports?
No, one of my pals is the present ambassador, Tom Watson. We've done a lot of skiing together. And he's a very generous fellow, and he likes to throw birthday parties for me. And he insisted on my birthday party being in Moscow. It's a little unusual.
It's so grand to have you. We're going to throw it back to John Chancellor. Could you give us your famous sign-off as you do that?
Yeah, hello, John, and so long until tomorrow.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. 89 years old and going strong.
Sounds exactly as he did when I first heard him at about, I don't know, the age of 10. And he's an inspiration to us all. We really should give him the Brevity Award, too, because he got up on the platform, made a speech, said all that needed to be said it nicely, and did it in 1 minute.
We'll be back after this.
Back in 1975, I made a film using a 75 Ford LTD. This is my 1980 LTD. Quite a contrast, believe me. Outside, much leaner, smaller. It's roomier inside, and so comfortable. And more surprises, over 50% better estimated gas mileage with an automatic overdrive option you can't find on competitive American-built cars. See the 1980 LTD soon. You'll be impressed by what Ford has done to make this car act a lot smaller.
When I've got minor arthritis pain, I need help. So I turn to the warming power of Bengay. Bengay's got warming power I apply right where it hurts. I rub in Bengay and feel that glorious warming power really deep, drawing the pain right out for hours of relief. No wonder Bengay is America's #1 selling arthritis rub. It's got warming power.
When arthritis pain grips you, break the grip of pain with Bengay.
Summer. Time for floats and fleas. Time to get tan and get ticks. This summer, protect your pet, home, and family. Get your dog or cat the Hearts 2-in-1 Plus collar. The first collar to kill fleas and ticks for 5 full months.
Its fast-acting odorless ingredients won't vaporize, stays on your pet.
The Hearts collar works, even if it gets wet. Summer. Time to get your pet the Hearts 2-in-1 Plus collar.
2 acceptance speeches are scheduled for tonight, one by George Bush and later the final speech of the convention by Ronald Reagan, and the odds are very high that they will both accept and that demonstrations, spontaneous of course, will follow. These are being organized now. Judy Woodruff, who is on the perimeter of the Joe Louis Arena, has a report about that. Judy?
Yes, we have a little activity out here in the perimeter, David. I'm talking with Ed Vogel from California. He is one of the Youth for Reagan delegates. Ed, David Brinkley was just saying that this is a spontaneous demonstration you're going to have. It's not really spontaneous, though, is it?
Well, not totally, but just about. We're going to have a good time. We brought in several people, young people out from across the country to participate and have a good time in the convention. This is one way they can do it.
What are you doing out here right now? You've got these signs printed up, and you've got those hats with the Reagan headband and so forth. What are you giving the people who are going to be marching around the floor?
Well, we're giving them signs and hats and a couple of noisemakers and telling them to have a really good time. They're all really happy that Governor Reagan's been nominated, and they're going to show it.
Nobody brought his own noisemaker or hats or so forth. It's all being provided here.
No, we've been painting signs all week long out at the university. I think a lot of people have noticed a lot of homemade signs, both at the governor's rally on Monday when he arrived and throughout the convention week. We painted all of those, about 8,000 of them.
It looks like you did a professional job. We've been talking with Ed Vogel, a Youth for Reagan delegate. Back to the booth.
Thank you, Judy. Let's go down to the floor now. The roll call of the states has begun for selection of a nominee for vice president.
Colorado cast 28 votes for George Bush, 2 abstaining, and 1 vote for Eugene Schroeder, the founder of the American Agriculture Movement.
Colorado, 28 votes for George Bush, 1 vote for Gene Schroeder, 2 not voting.
Connecticut, 35 votes.
Mr. Chairman, Connecticut, the state that gave us U.S. Senator Prescott Bush, proudly cast 35 votes for one of its own, the son of U.S. Senator Prescott Bush and the next Vice President of the United States, the Honorable George Bush.
Connecticut, 35 votes for George Bush.
Delaware, 12 votes.
Mr. Chairman, to announce the Delaware vote, I present Delegate Frank DeMundy.
Mr. Chairman, we of Delaware proudly cast 12 votes for George Bush.
Delaware, 12 votes for George Bush.
District of Columbia, 14 votes.
The District of Columbia, whose delegation consists of an equal number of men and women, whites and minorities, old and young, wishes to enthusiastically cast all of its 14 votes for a great man and the next Vice President of the United States, George Bush.
District of Columbia, 14 votes for George Bush.
Florida, 51 votes.
Before casting our vote, Florida would like to point out one oversight of this convention and announce its appreciation for a great United States congressman who has not appeared here. Florida salutes Phil Crane. Our vote is 47 votes for Bush, 3 abstentions, and 1 opposed.
47, 3 and 1.
Would you repeat that, please? Would Florida delegation, would the chairman of the Florida delegation please repeat that vote?
47 Bush,
3 abstentions, and 1 opposed. He didn't say who the hell he opposed.
Florida, 47 votes for George Bush, 4 not voting.
Georgia, 36 votes.
Mr. Chairman, Georgia cast 22 votes for George Bush.
Tom Brokaw down on the floor has found an interesting lady, and he wants to talk to her, and we want to hear it. Tom?
Thank you, David. This is Catherine Heyerholzer, a delegate from Ohio, sitting on this floor voting for Ronald Reagan as the Republican presidential nominee. And the first time that she met him was under slightly different circumstances. Isn't that right?
Right. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, where I was receptionist at the General Electric Company.
Yes, that was how long ago?
26 years ago.
And did you know who he was when he walked into the door?
Of course I did.
And what did you think about him?
I thought he was very personable, and he was doing community relations, and he did an excellent job of it.
Did you say to yourself, that man one day is going to be the Republican presidential nominee?
No, but I thought he'd climb.
Yeah. We're going to show you a picture, if we can, right here. There is Ronald Reagan. How are we doing with that? Oh, there it is, right there. Randy, if you just take a look at that. Ronald Reagan, 26 years ago. And look at him. He doesn't look a whole lot older than he does today, or a whole lot younger than he does today.
No, I think he looks very much like he does today.
That's a remarkable thing. Now, Catherine, which one are you? You want to point out?
I happen to be the blonde.
Okay. Catherine Heyerholzer, Republican delegate from the state of Ohio, voting for Ronald Reagan for the Republican presidential nomination 26 years ago, 26 years after she met him as a General Electric receptionist in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Quite a thrill.
Pardon?
It must be quite a thrill for you.
Yes, it is. It really is.
Well, thank you very much, and I know you'll treasure that picture. You don't want to give that one up.
That's right. Thank you.
Thank you. Now to Tom Pettit.
Well, Tom, we're here with funny hats, and the main delegation, the main people don't think they're so funny, I guess. Barry Putnam, right?
Yes.
Now, isn't that hat a silly hat to be wearing?
No, I don't think so. This hat symbolizes one of the product that we're most proud of in Maine, which is lobsters. And it's a hat that has got a lot of attention, and we were surprised the last states knew what they were right off.
Uh-huh. What are they exactly again now?
They're sou'westers.
They're sou'westers. Okay. Mrs. Russell over here dreamed it up. Doris Russell, is that it?
Yes.
From where in Maine?
Castine, Maine.
And you thought this idea up?
That's the home of Maine Maritime Academy. We train merchant seamen.
Looks kind of weird.
Oh, no.
No?
Oh, no.
No, don't you feel silly wearing a hat like that?
No, I find they're awfully pleasant, they're convenient. I like it one thing because I can locate all of my delegation where they are or where they're up in the balcony down. No, I think they work very good and we've got a lot of attention.
Okay, well, there's a sensible hat down below in Iowa. Reagan hat, 3 elephants, 2 flags.
She's had a lot more pictures taken of her than I have.
We sell some lobsters, too.
Oh, all right. You got them with you, or do you deliver?
Oh, right there. I deliver.
Oh, thank you. Where's Garrick in Guam?
Here we are in Guam, right behind Puerto Rico at the rear of the convention hall, talking to Pedro Perez, Guam's delegation chairman, who just cast 4 votes for George Bush, and you called them the 4 most expensive votes in this convention.
That is correct.
How much did it cost to come here for each of you?
Approximately $3,000 for each.
And you come $3,000 for each of the delegates, and you never are really in the limelight here.
Well, so far, I'm glad that we are making up for the past few days.
I know at every convention we often hear the phrase, Guam is where America's day begins. But are there any political problems you try to push along here, and does anybody listen to you that affect you on Guam?
Yes. Like, for example, our biggest problem now is the dumping of nuclear waste in our own backyard without anybody ever consulting to us. That's one of our biggest problems.
Now, does anybody listen to you? Do you take it to the platform committee?
Well, we have brought that to the attention of some of the leaders here. And we have also brought it to the existing administration in Washington.
But you haven't gotten any action?
No favorable action.
So you're going back to Guam?
Well, we are going back to Guam and and I hope that through the media that we will be heard, at least by the people. If the administration will not hear us, at least the people will hear us.
Well, this is probably the only time your message is getting across at this convention. It certainly wasn't in the Republican platform. Thank you very much. Pedro Perez of the Guam delegation, the 4 most expensive votes at this convention. Now up to David Brinkley.
Delegates coming here pay for everything themselves, you know. We've been asked about that. They do. They pay all their own expenses, and the amount depends on how far you have to come to get here. They came the farthest. I think they told us the average is about $1,000 per person, airplane, hotel, and so on. At the far end of the Joe Louis Arena, in what they call the VIP section, is Frank Sinatra, who normally, when he is in a hall with this many people, sings "I Did It My Way." Tonight, he is sitting quietly, listening to others. We'll be back in a moment.
Aspirin intake is probably up by now at this hour in this convention on its fourth day. And one delegate who supported George Bush, who has had his ups and downs, in the Connecticut delegation said, "I can't take it. 1 minute the pits and the next right on top. I just can't take it." Well, they won. Others didn't. On the floor, Chris Wallace.
That's right, John. I'm in the Indiana delegation with Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana, and let's be brutally frank about it. You were one of the losers this week. Do you feel like a loser?
No, I feel like a winner, Chris. We had a wonderful opportunity to say a lot of things, and anyone who's interested in public issues needs a forum and an opportunity. And so I'm grateful to Governor Reagan for considering me and giving me the opportunity, really, for this week.
You got a lot of free publicity this week. Are you better known? Do you get the feeling more people are recognizing you?
I think so, and I'm indebted to you and to others for making that possible.
One of the things people were saying about you this week that wasn't so nice is they said Richard Lugar is boring. Are you boring?
Well, I don't think so. I've had a reasonably a controversial life. I hope that things have been resolved happily in most instances, but it has been a rather adventurous, if not spectacular, existence.
Do people tell you to be more exciting, though, some of your aides?
No, I think anybody who's worked with me has found life very exciting, and in due course, maybe a wider circle will find that, too.
Is George Bush a good choice for the ticket?
Yes, he is. A very sound choice. He'll be an excellent candidate, has been all year. Clearly the consensus choice at this convention.
Would Richard Lugar have been a better choice?
Well, that is in the eye of the beholder, and there was just one judge. I think he's made a good decision.
Senator Richard Lugar, thanks very much. Maybe he'll be mentioned again in 4 years. Back to the booth.
This is George Bush leaving a hotel. I think it's the Pontchartrain. Where he has been staying, to come over to the convention hall.
And where the Secret Service has been blocking off the elevator so we can't get in and out.
That's right. His speech is scheduled in about an hour and 20 minutes. We've got some other business to go through here before, but that's the crowd in the hotel lobby. The Pontchartrain has been probably less crowded than most of the nearby hotels. Until Bush arrived there, and then it suddenly crowded up. One of those who was involved in the negotiations on President Ford's side yesterday with the Reagan camp was Congressman Richard Cheney, who used to be President. I'll start that again. One of the people who was involved in the negotiations yesterday on behalf of President Ford was his former chief of staff, now a congressman, Richard Cheney. And we've got an interview with him.
In the Wyoming alternate section with Dick Cheney asking what finally caused it all to break down.
Well, I don't know for certain, Tom, because I was here on the floor at the time that happened. It seems to me that they both made a good faith effort to try to put it together, but in the end, they simply weren't able to meet the various requirements that both of them had.
Did you think it was a serious proposition?
Well, I would have said 48 hours before that there was no way to put it together. And then during the course of the day yesterday, it was clear that the governor was very serious about making the effort and that President Ford was willing to consider it.
Weren't some of the ideas constitutionally somewhat dubious?
Well, I don't think there was a constitutional problem with it. I think the bottom line is there can only be one president at a time. I think it was clear in this particular instance that ultimately they were unable to work out an arrangement that was satisfactory. You know, it would have been a unique situation in history to have a former president serving as vice president. I do think they both made a good faith effort, and they got to be committed on that, but in the end it didn't work, and I was frankly somewhat ambivalent on it.
I thought it would have been a great ticket, but on the other hand, it would have been asking an awful lot of President Ford, and he's already done a great deal for the country, and it was difficult for us to ask him to go that extra step and put himself back in the position of being a vice presidential candidate again.
Politically, wasn't President Ford responsible for dragging it out as long as it was dragged out yesterday? Or was that Reagan's fault?
Oh, I don't think it was anybody's fault. I think if you'd had to have an early decision, the decision probably would have been no, and I think both parties were willing to consider it through the day to see if it wasn't possible to find some accommodation.
Was it your impression that the governor, former governor of California, really wanted Ford at almost any price?
I think they both were willing to explore the possibility. Obviously, in the end, the governor wasn't willing to accept him at any price because they were unable to work it out.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Richard Cheney, Congressman, Wyoming, former Chief of Staff of President Ford. Now, you see, George Bush is arriving.
Yeah, George Bush is arriving.
And on cue, George Bush is arriving.
Well, you waited to hear Tom Pettit say that. It's only about 100 or 200 yards from here to the Pontchartrain, but the entrance they're using is on the far end of the hall, and so it is a little bit of a trip. He will speak first, of course. There will be a little demonstration, and then Ronald Reagan will arrive and make his acceptance speech.
35 votes for George Bush, 2 votes for Jesse Helms.
And that'll be that.
George and Barbara Bush have been in motorcades since January in the Iowa caucuses when all of this began. It's a strange life that candidates lead. It is really not their own. There is very, very little time for them. With all the primaries that we had this year, going from state to state, motorcade to motorcade, this scene repeated endlessly until the mind has to reel. It is just so divorced from reality that it's hard for ordinary citizens to understand it.
Nebraska.
John, I talked once, and I can't remember now which one it was, and it doesn't matter. A campaigning candidate who was going from town to town to town to motel to motel.
The great silver state of Nevada, which had the great pleasure of placing in nomination the name of Ronald Reagan last night as president, is also proud to cast all 17 votes for George Bush.
Nevada, 17 votes for George Bush.
This may bring him the necessary votes. I guess he's over now.
He's over. He is nominated.
Mr. Chairman, New Hampshire, the fastest growing state in the Northeast, makes its contribution to a winning team by casting all of its 22 votes for George Bush.
New Hampshire, 22 votes
so
for
the
George
ticket
Bush.
is now complete, and the parliamentary and legal obligations have been met.
66 votes. Mr. Chairman, New Jersey is the home of Pat Stewart. As co-chairman of its unified delegation, I yield to Nicholas Brady.
New Jersey enthusiastically and unanimously cast 66 votes for George Herbert Walker Bush.
New Jersey.
We saw up on that tally that Congressman Phil Crane, I'm not sure that there were any votes on that tally for Congressman Phil Crane.
There were.
And, but he's here in the hall, not very happy about things, as I understand it. But right now, before we get into that, Chris Wallace, who is in the VIP section, has a well-known guest. Chris?
That's right. It's the chairman of the board, Frank Sinatra, along with Mrs. Sinatra. You've been to conventions before, haven't you?
I've been to a few, yes, I have.
It's quite a scene, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. It's pretty exciting. It usually is. I mean, we know pretty much what's coming all the time, but it's still a pretty exciting moment. Due to the fact I think it comes every 4 years rather than every year.
You're a big Ronald Reagan fan, aren't you?
Very big. He's an old friend, and I'm delighted he was nominated, and I think he'll make a wonderful president.
Now, you were once a liberal Democrat, and I guess you've become more conservative over the years. Some people say that's true of the country. Why is that?
I think maybe the liberal approach didn't work as well as it should have, and I think maybe a lot of us have moved away from it. It didn't fulfill a lot of the promises it was supposed to.
Some people say that Governor Reagan isn't qualified to run the country because he used to be an entertainer.
Oh, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. Harry Truman played the piano, Nixon played the piano. They could entertain you also. I don't think that means anything.
You going to sing at the inauguration?
I don't know. I haven't been asked yet. I will. I'd be honored to be asked to do it if they ask me.
Frank Sinatra, thanks very much.
Okay.
Now to Garrett Utley on the floor.
With Congressman Phil Crane of Illinois, who has received a vote for the vice presidential nomination, the first vote cast by Alabama. Congressman, you ran for the presidency. There were some flyers around here for the vice presidential spot your supporters put out, and yet you were the one presidential candidate in the past primary season who has not been invited to speak here. How do you feel about this?
Well, I think it was a personal slight to me and a greater slight to a lot of people on the floor of this convention hall. There are many people here who worked very diligently on my behalf, and many more than that who preferred one of the other candidates, but I was their second choice. And so it locked me out of an opportunity to speak to them in a way that obviously they were supportive. And I think further that it's a tacky thing to do.
Now, your message, however, some people argue, has gotten through. Some people were saying earlier in there, you were running in case Ronald Reagan faltered. You had more or less the same political line, and you would pick up the Reagan pieces. That didn't happen. Do you have anything you disagree with Reagan? Are you unhappy politically, let us say, as opposed to some personal unhappiness?
Oh, no, I'm not unhappy with Ronald Reagan's nomination at all. And in fact, as soon as I got out of the race in April, I urged all of our people still in the primary to get behind Reagan and support him. I did it for Reagan in 75, 76. I did it for Reagan in 68. And I don't have any trouble at all. And I've indicated to him after the convention that I will go anywhere he asks me to help campaign for that ticket.
Phil Crane from Illinois, thank you very much. Now over to Tom Brokaw.
Alan Greenspan, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Ford, last night one of the principal negotiators with the Reagan staff about any kind of a possible arrangement between President Ford and Ronald Reagan on the ticket. What's the biggest distortion, as you have seen it thus far, in the descriptions of those negotiations?
Tom, I think the concept of what is being now called a shared presidency is an extreme exaggeration of what, in fact, was going on. There was never any intention or any discussion of changing the constitutional prerogatives of the presidency, and the only alterations that were being involved in an enhanced vice presidency really represented shifting of various managerial functions which would allow the vice president to do the types of things which probably is inappropriately now being done by the chief of staff.
You wanted him to be some kind of an operational man and let the president be the chief executive officer.
That's exactly right.
Now, did you ask for specific delineation of duties for Mr. Ford under this?
We had it wasn't any requests. We were in the sense of discussions, and in those discussions, which in fact all individuals participated, we were trying to take a general point of view which we all shared and tried to put specific elements of it to the test.
What do you mean? You'd say, for instance, if we were to agree to do this, would you let Mr. Ford be in charge of this area?
No, not at all. In fact, that is negotiation and conditions. What we were discussing was the fact of what this type of enhanced vice presidency would imply. There were no negotiations that went on in that sense.
All right. Alan Greenspan, who was one of those principal negotiators last night, had this place astir, and tonight, appropriately enough, he's wearing a tag that says entertainer. I don't know, does that mean that you qualified for it after last night?
Apparently.
Thank you very much, Alan Greenspan. Now to David Brinkley.
It's a badge that gets him into the hall. That's what it is.
Some people will do anything to get in the hall. I found some of his ideas kind of entertaining, I must say. I think the whole business of a reworked vice presidency, if this convention did anything, and a lot of people think it will elect Ronald Reagan, and they think that's something, But if it does focus on the question of the vice presidency, and if some commission can be formed or some way be found to enlarge the office of vice president, I think that would be a very good thing.
If it could be done, but it is very difficult. We were agreeing last night. We never did report that Ford had made the deal, by the way. I would like to point that out. Because it would be so difficult to do it. The president's constitutional prerogatives are very precisely spelled out. There is, it spells out nothing for the vice president except to preside over the Senate. And his duties are whatever the president chooses to give him. And anything he doesn't want to do, he doesn't have to do. He's a totally free agent. So it would always have been seen as difficult, and as it turned out, it was impossible. We'll be back in a moment.
Congressman Jack Kemp of New York was a big name here at this convention yesterday and the day before, when it appeared that he was on Ronald Reagan's short list to be the vice presidential nominee. Tonight so far in the balloting for the vice presidential spot, Kemp has received, and it isn't over yet, but he has received only 33 votes. Well, that's politics. You see it there now. Bush 1497, Kemp 33. If Ronald Reagan's decision had been different, those names might be reversed and those numbers might be reversed. In any case, Congressman Kemp is with Chris Wallace on the floor.
My move is to help.
We're here with
Reagan
Congressman Jack Kemp of New York, who, as you say, was on the short list. Now it's all over. Any sense of disappointment?
No, it's not all over at all. I think 1980 is going to be a tremendous year. I'm excited about our platform, Chris, and particularly excited about the Reagan-Bush candidacy, and I think it's an opportunity for the Republican Party for the first time in a long time to go into the cities, go into the Northeast, go into the blue-collar areas of this country, go to blacks and Hispanics, and really have a platform and a candidacy that is going to appeal to people as opposed to special interests.
Well, that's a good campaign speech, but in a personal sense...
You heard it before, right?
Yeah, I've heard it before. In a personal sense, there must be some sense of disappointment. You're a competitor, a former pro football player.
I'm very competitive. Well, thank you, Chris. I'm very competitive, and most of my competition has been on the ideas, and I think that platform reflects some rather positive ideas that I have been advancing, and very frankly, I think it's a very progressive platform. So my competition this week has been in that speech, in that platform, and on the values and ideas that I've been trying to advance.
In just a practical sense, haven't you gained an enormous amount this week just from all the publicity?
Well, I'm pleased that I've been able to stand up there and get that reception, to see some of these ideas implemented. So from that standpoint, I think I've had a good week, and I think I have a future.
Would you have been a better choice than George Bush?
George Bush is a good choice, and
would you have been a better one?
Well, George Bush and Governor Reagan and our platform combined give us the best choice available.
Jack Kemp,
thank you, Chris.
Now to Garrett Gutland.
And we're here with Tully Plesser, a political pollster who does polling for the Republican National Committee and who yesterday was in on some of the initial discussions with former President Gerald Ford, discussing what Ford might add to a Republican ticket. And then later during the day here on the convention floor last night, you were one of the prime sources for the reports that the Ford-Reagan deal was on. There were many rumors going around. Can you describe what happened last night?
I think what happened last night is that I listened to a lot of people in the hall and watched a lot of television and decided that a decision had been made that evidently hadn't been. I think the lesson, and it's a good lesson for everyone, is that the presidential nominee, the top of the ticket, really chooses his running mate. And all of the advisors, no matter how well-intentioned, or all of the pollsters or press people, really don't have the ultimate say. I think Governor Reagan made a decision. I happen to think it was an excellent decision, but he reminded us of what that final quality or capability is.
And reminded journalists also not to get ahead of the story.
Oh, I think so. I think so.
Thank you very much. Tully Plesser, for the pollster for the RNC. Now back to David Brinkley.
They're still calling the roll, getting down close to the end. Jessica Savage, who is on the podium and keeps the most careful watch on everything that happens down there, has a report for us on what's going to happen next. Jessica?
We just heard that there's a very good possibility that Gerald Ford will be coming into the hall tonight and may, in fact, come here in a show of unity. And it's almost an exact reversal of a situation we had back in 1972.
Back there when I get through with this.
Okay. This is John Rhodes, and is permanent chairman. Is Gerald Ford coming here tonight?
I'm not sure. I haven't heard.
We had heard that he was, and it would be a show of unity, and I remember you told me back in Washington that in '72 it was you who brought Ronald Reagan up here. Do you think it might be possible that might happen with Gerald Ford?
I did my very best to get Ronald Reagan, but finally Gerald Ford got him. You'll recall that he went to the edge of the platform. First thing he said to me when he came on the platform is, "Where is Ronald Reagan?" So I pointed him out, and he went over to the side of the platform and beckoned to him, and Ronald Reagan pointed himself with a questioning voice, "You mean me?" And Gerald Ford said, "Yes, I mean you." So down he came. I don't know where President Ford is.
Well, it's possible then we heard he might show up tonight. Back to the booth, John Chancellor.
And what you're seeing on your screen is the motorcade of the presidential nominee of the Republican Party, Ronald Reagan, leaving the Detroit Plaza Hotel area and heading toward Joe Louis Arena. And his life, too, will be a succession of motorcades, as it has been all year, with the cameramen riding on the backs of the station wagons. It's kind of interesting listening to Jack Kemp, Congressman Kemp, earlier, avoiding Chris Wallace's question. He avoided saying that he, Jack Kemp, thinks he would have been a better choice than Bush. That is protocol here among many of the delegates and people who hope for some luck at this convention. But former Treasury Secretary William Simon made a speech on Monday night, and when he left, he was quoted as having said, "I'm surely the best. I mean, the country could do worse and probably will, and I say that seriously." Well, he really meant it.
He was asked, Kemp was asked the question twice and evaded it both times.
That's right, rather neatly, I thought.
The schedule now, in a minute, they have nominated Bush. He is over the necessary number. He will speak first because they don't want anybody to have to follow the presidential acceptance speech. This is the Reagan motorcade, Bush's motorcade, somewhat shorter. We saw a few minutes ago, he is already in the hall waiting in, shall I say, the green room to go on the podium and accept. Reagan coming along behind him to accept the nomination for president. They'll pull the strings on the balloons, and that'll be that. That's Joe Louis Arena, that looming presence to your right, a huge building near the river.
The Reagan speech is the product of a number of people in the Reagan camp. Dozens of people contributed ideas to it. The first draft was written by Peter Hannaford, who has been writing for Ronald Reagan for about the last 7 years. And all indications are that Ronald Reagan will try to reach out in the acceptance speech he gives tonight to talk about women, to talk about blacks, to talk about Hispanics possibly, to offset to some degree some of the tough language in the Republican platform that was drafted and approved here in Detroit. It'll be a very interesting speech to analyze, because in that speech will be the themes of the Reagan-Bush campaign this fall.
They started writing this speech about 6 weeks ago, and this afternoon Reagan went out to the house of an industrialist, a friend of his, in Grosse Pointe, a suburb of Detroit, and spent an hour or so practicing the speech using some sort of prompting device to be sure he had it down cold for delivery here in the hall tonight. They've also told us, as you said, I think, that it will not be primarily addressed to the delegates in the hall, but to the television audience in general, the thinking being that the delegates in the hall are already going to vote for him. He doesn't have to preach to them. So he will try to reach and persuade people outside this hall.
On all three networks,
yes.
On a politician's dream, he may be outdrawn by old movies. They won't be his because they're not being shown these days. But in any case, it's a great moment for Ronald Reagan, something that every politician looks forward to, and we'll be back with more of this convention after this.
I'm Pete Conrad. 15 years ago, Gordon Cooper and I shoehorned ourselves into a Gemini spacecraft like this and flew for 8 days in Earth orbit. McDonnell Douglas built the Gemini and the Mercury as well. Fact is, in my 4 flights, I've traveled more than 17 million miles in spacecraft built by McDonnell Douglas. Today we're using our space-age skills to build 2 of the world's leading fighters for the United States and our allies, the F-15 Eagle and the F-18 Hornet. The same skill and technology goes into the DC-10, one of the most thoroughly tested airliners ever built. And I think it's significant that the DC-10 has passed tests just as demanding in their own way as those required of our fighters. I know firsthand the kind of product this company builds because I work here. I wouldn't stake my reputation on anything less.
Convention Moments. Edwin Newman footnotes the Republican Convention of 1964. Brought to you by the Bell System Yellow Pages. The first step, let your fingers do the walking through the Bell System Yellow Pages.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue.
San Francisco, 1964. Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona accepting the Republican nomination. To the party's conservatives, and they were in the majority here, Goldwater was the convention hero, just as Nelson Rockefeller had been the villain earlier when he called on the convention to repudiate the John Birch Society and groups like it. The treatment of Rockefeller, seen by millions on television, and Goldwater's statement, open as it was to misinterpretation, helped to destroy whatever chance the Republicans had of winning in November. Edwin Newman, NBC News.
There's a stage wait here in Joe Louis Arena. Coming up next will be the vice presidential acceptance. It'll be a few minutes. And then Reagan's acceptance speech. So in the meantime, there's an interesting development in American politics this year. As you know, the federal government gives money to candidates for president on condition that they spend only a set limited amount. There is, however, another aspect. Private citizens on their own, or who can pretend to be on their own and get away with it, can raise money privately and spend it themselves, promoting whatever candidate they like. And the Supreme Court ruled this is legal because they are citizens using their right of free speech. One of those involved in this is Senator Harrison Schmitt of New Mexico, who is raising a private fund to be used to promote the election of Ronald Reagan. There's a good deal of controversy about this. Some think it is bad news, a bad idea, should not be allowed, and so on. In any case, Garrick Utley is on the floor with Senator Schmitt and is going to ask him about this. Garrick?
Senator Harrison Jack Schmitt of New Mexico, who before he entered politics was an astronaut on Apollo 17, the 12th man to land and walk on the moon, which has absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about now, Senator. You have this organization called Americans for Change. You say you're going to collect $20 million or more for Ronald Reagan's campaign, but you say you are not part of the formal campaign, which means Ronald Reagan can end up getting maybe $50, $60 million to spend. Now, this is being challenged in the courts. Is what you're doing really fair? I'm not talking about whether it's legal, but do you think it's really fair?
I think it's very fair. It's certainly legal and constitutional. It's fair because the basic law is flawed. You can't equalize financing when the incumbent has such great power of incumbency. Plus, the volunteer efforts on both sides are going to be unequal. We really ought to take another look at that whole law, but as it stands right now, the independent financing that we can provide and others can provide will be a balance to the incumbency.
Now, how can you say you're independent of the Reagan campaign if you're all sharing the same political interests, you know each other, many of you work for Ronald Reagan's nomination?
Well, it's because we're not coordinating in any way with his campaign. We're doing everything completely independently. The mere fact that I'm a Republican and he's a Republican really has nothing to do with the matter.
Now, if your group reaches your goal and other similar groups reach their goals, how much money do you think the independent groups could collect?
Well, it's hard to say. We've estimated that overall there's about $20 to $30 million that could be contributed to groups like ours based on the primaries, what was contributed in the primaries. But only time will tell how well we do at the fundraising. I think we can do very well at the expenditures if we raise the money. Our initial budget's $18.5.
Thank you very much. Senator Schmidt from New Mexico. Now over to Tom Pettit.
Carrick, we're in the rear of the demonstration with Senator Charles McMathias of Maryland. They've been talking about independent finance committees and fundraising committees. Do you approve of such fundraising, Senator?
I've always felt that there ought to be limitations. In fact, I even offered an amendment which was accepted by the Congress, which would limit what a candidate could contribute to his own campaign.
Well, do you think this kind of committee that Senator Schmidt is heading will backfire in this campaign, get bad publicity?
Well, I think the problem goes beyond this campaign. I think it goes to the perception of elections, and whether elections in this country can be bought. It seems to me that the Constitution very clearly gives to the Congress the right, or in fact the duty, to regulate federal elections.
Senator Mathias, we're lost in the crowd. Here's Tom Brokaw.
All right, Tom Pettit, I'm over here with the three of the top hands of the Bush campaign, with Jim Baker, with Dean Burch, and Pete Thiele. Let me ask, beginning with you, Jim, where do you think that your man can do the most good for the ticket? The Northeast?
Well, I think he can do a lot of good in the Northeast, Tom, but he'll do very well in Texas. He got 48% of the vote in Texas, showed substantial strength in the metropolitan areas of Houston and Dallas, and I think he'll be very strong in New England, too.
Dean Burch, what kind of issues do you think that your man? What kind of issues do you think your man can help the Reagan ticket with the most? Issues.
I think he can help them on all the issues, Tom. There are no subjects that are off bounds. He can deal with anything that Governor Reagan asked him to deal with.
Pete Thiele is Director of Communications. You're going to spend a lot of your time, it seems to me, in the coming weeks, trying to explain the difference between George Bush, vice presidential nominee, and George Bush, candidate. All those differences between his primary campaign and the primary campaign of Ronald Reagan, don't you think?
No, that's not going to be tough, Tom. There are very few differences between Governor Reagan and Ambassador Bush during the campaign. Frankly, if you take a look at it, it was probably one of the...
well, what about the 30% tax cut? That was a big
Well,
difference.
I think if you look at the tax cut introduced by Barbara Conable in the House on behalf of Governor Reagan and other leaders in the House, that it's very close to what George Bush was proposing. And I think that if you look at the second and third year portions of that, it's something that George Bush can wholeheartedly support.
Jim Baker, did you have any divided feelings last night? 4 years ago, you were the national political director, whatever your title was, for Gerald Ford, and it looked for a time last night as if he might be the vice presidential nominee, and your candidate this time would not be. Did you have some divided feelings?
Well, of course I did, Tom, and I think that's only natural. I guess that would be expected because I have enormous respect, of course, for President Ford. I likewise have enormous respect for my close friend George Bush, for whom I've worked for a year and a half.
Dean Burch, you worked in the White House. Did you ever have any feeling last night that that deal could be worked out so that there could be if not a co-presidency, some widened responsibility?
Tom, I had the distinct feeling about 11 o'clock that it could be worked out. I didn't have any idea what the mechanics would be, but yes, I did. I was concerned about how it would work.
Now, what happens from here on? What's the best? Does George Bush become the point man for Ronald Reagan, and he become the kind of senior statesman? Vice presidents are often that in these campaigns.
No, I don't think it's going to be a slashing type campaign, Tom. I think it's going to be a campaign based on the issues. These two men obviously feel that what they're offering to the American people is much more appealing to what President Carter's come up with over the last 4 years. And I don't think that you're going to see a real gut-cutting type presidential campaign.
Do you expect that George Bush will concentrate on one part of the country over another? If you leave the West to Ronald Reagan, he'll work the Northeast, for example, and maybe Texas?
Well, it would seem to make sense, but that won't be determined until the next 3 or 4 days, and we'll know a little bit more then.
24 hours ago, at this time last night, did you think you'd be standing on the floor tonight in this capacity, on the staff of the vice presidential nominee? I remind you that it is now, about 9 o'clock. 24 hours ago tnight, it looked pretty grim for you.
In all honesty, no, I didn't.
And you?
No, sir.
And you?
Honestly, no.
Did you think a deal had been struck at some point at about this time between Ford and Reagan?
At about this time, it looked very much out here on the floor like one had been struck, Tom. I must confess that I, deep down inside, did not think that President Ford would take the nomination.
Thanks, Jim Baker. Now let's go to the podium, and there is the man that you've all been working for, George Bush, the vice presidential nominee with his entire family.
And her Bush
I'm
family.
sorry, it's just the family. I looked up and thought I'd spotted them all, but there's the family of George Bush.
Yeah. That's Barbara Bush, George Bush, his son, Jeb is there, Neil, Marvin, who are grandchildren, Dorothy, who is the youngest of the children. Have been married for 35 years, and they say they have lived in 28 homes in 17 cities in 35 years. They're very close. Mrs. Bush always says that there's only 6 things you can't criticize, and they are George Bush and my 5 children. She's a very attractive lady.
They also spent some time in China, of course.
Yes,
when
they
he was
did.
ambassador there. The chairman appointed a committee to inform George Bush he had been nominated for vice president. The duties of this committee are not onerous. They had to walk about 20 feet back from the rostrum, tell him what he already knew, and then escort him out, and their duties were then completed.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the next first family of the United States of America. Our presidential candidate's lovely and gracious wife, Nancy, his daughter, Patty, his son, Ron, another fine son, Michael, and his wife, Colleen, and his daughter, Maureen, the Reagans.
Maureen is 39 years old, and she is the product of Ronald Reagan's first marriage to the actress Jane Wyman. Michael, who is 35, was adopted. Patricia, who is 27, and Ron, who is 22, are the product of Mr. Reagan's marriage to Nancy Reagan, whom you see there in the middle.
One thing I found very appealing is that she disagrees with her father in public, states her views openly, candidly, and forcefully, and nobody seems to be upset about it.
That's right.
Ladies and gentlemen of the convention, and now I have the great personal honor of presenting to you the next Vice President of the United States, the Honorable George Bush of Texas.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, my fellow Republicans and fellow Americans, first let me just express my heartfelt thanks for the honor that you've given me, the opportunity to run on our party's national ticket with a great leader like Ronald Reagan. On behalf of Barbara, the rest of the Bush family, all I can say is that we're overwhelmed and grateful for your expression of confidence. With a deep sense of commitment, I accept your nomination to serve as our party's candidate for Vice President on a ticket headed by the leader of our party and the next President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. I accept. I enthusiastically support our platform, and I pledge to you my total dedication and energies in a united effort to see to it that next January 20th, Ronald Reagan becomes our nation's 40th president, and that a bright new era will begin for an America in the decade of this 80s. We need change. Because of Ronald Reagan's leadership, we Republicans emerged from this convention as a strong, united party, rededicated to the principles that have made our country great. And there has been a spirit of victory in the air this past week here in Detroit. But if that spirit is to be translated into reality, it's up to each and every one of us to help carry Ronald Reagan's message of a strong, free America the length and the breadth of this land. Let there be no mistake, though. Jimmy Carter, though he may have in the past 4 years been a failed president, he is a formidable campaigner who can be expected to use the power of his office to suit his own political ends. And so, my fellow Republicans, I say to you, let's forget the pollsters and forget the pundits and remember only that political victories are hard, dedicated things that come about only by tough work, and that in this crucial election year, the stakes for America and the free world are too great to allow ourselves to become complacent. We have a great mission, not unlike that great mission undertaken by our party 28 summers ago, when another great Republican leader, Dwight Eisenhower, began his campaign to restore the faith of the American people in their government. Dwight Eisenhower, a man of decency, compassion, and strength, led America 3 days ago into a new era of peace, prosperity, and progress. And so will Ronald Reagan, a man of decency, compassion, and strength, lead America into a new era of greatness in this decade of the 1980s. That is the mission, the great mission. All of us working together, joined by millions of disillusioned Democrats and disappointed independents, must undertake in the campaign ahead. My fellow Republicans, this is Ronald Reagan's night. He is the man whom you and the American people are waiting to hear. Let me then conclude these words of acceptance by paraphrasing what I told this convention last evening, just moments before you nominated our party's standard bearer for the presidency. Let us, I said then and I repeat tonight, let us, united in spirit and purpose, go forward from this convention city to make 1980 one of victory, not only for Ronald Reagan and our party, but for the United States of America and the cause of freedom throughout the world. Thank you very, very much.
The Reagan film, which is, I assume, next, is scheduled for 10 o'clock, and it's now 10 after 9.
9:25, introduction and acceptance speech to the vice presidential nominees.
Yeah.
Then it says demonstration.
Yeah.
Then it says Bush speech.
Well, no, it says introduction and acceptance speech is scratched out in that line. Mine is a Xerox, and it's very faint. Reagan's acceptance speech will be coming along shortly. We'll be back in a moment.
National Convention, brought to you in part by New York Life, the company that meets your insurance needs. Now, reporting from the NBC News Convention Center in Joe Louis Arena, here is John Chancellor.
And the evening is proceeding a little ahead of schedule, and that one reason for that is, quite a lot ahead of schedule as a matter of fact, is because we expect former President Ford to come in and in a show of unity and togetherness to address the convention, probably before, I think almost certainly before, Governor Reagan himself makes his acceptance speech. The Bush family is still accepting the plaudits of the crowd, and William Casey, the campaign manager for Ronald Reagan, is somewhere in there with Garrick Utley.
We're down here talking to William Casey, the campaign director of the Reagan campaign. Mr. Casey, we've heard a lot of versions as to what happened last night during the discussions between the Reagan forces and Gerald Ford. Now, you were central to those discussions. What happened?
Everybody hear me?
Yes.
I can't.
A lot of people can hear you.
I can't hear myself. Well, we simply explored the possibility of developing a role which gives the Vice President a broader involvement in the conduct of the White House staff. It's been widely misrepresented in the press. There was never any thought of sharing presidential powers, never any thought of giving up any of the powers and responsibilities of the presidency. The White House staff has only the power to develop options and make recommendations. The final decision-making power is and has to be with the president.
Well, if you were not prepared prepared to give up any substantive power to a Vice President Ford, how come the negotiations went on so long? The issue would have seemed to have been settled much earlier, much more easily.
They didn't go on that long. We were talking about various ways of involving the Vice President in the operation of the White House.
Could you give me an example?
Well, the Vice President would have input into appointments. He would have the power to direct certain segments of the White House staff. Other segments would make recommendations to the President through the Vice President. And these were all just the kind of things that were discussed among...
What was it that Gerald Ford was asking that was unacceptable to you?
I'm not sure that he was asking anything. He decided at the last minute that he just didn't think it would work and he couldn't do it. That was based on a number of considerations, many of which were personal to him, as I understood it, and as President Ford described it to us.
Are you sorry now that perhaps you got involved in this whole negotiating process in the first place?
Oh, no. I think it was a very constructive thing to do. It showed that Governor Reagan is open-minded about using the talents of an experienced president to strengthen and improve the White House operation.
To what extent was Henry Kissinger a key negotiator or a key factor in formulating Gerald Ford's request for a position?
Well, Henry Kissinger participated in the discussions. We were passing suggestions back and forth. Some of them came from Alan Greenspan. Some of them came from Henry Kissinger. Some of them came from Ed Meese and our side. What we were talking about was not very different than the way Ronald Reagan worked with his lieutenant governor in California. And there was nothing that novel about it. It's been widely misperceived to have involved a grant of decision-making powers, negotiations, demands, and conditions. None of those things happened.
Are you irritated, or you're sort of irritated over what happened, perhaps with Gerald Ford for not coming around and agreeing in the end?
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. We understood perfectly that it would be a very important decision for him. A decision which he alone could make. We never stopped going forward with the process of with other candidates. We were always ready to make another selection.
Has there been any consideration that Gerald Ford should come to the convention hall tonight to display the unity along with George Bush and Ronald Reagan?
Well, we'll see about that.
You think there's a possibility that he may come tonight?
You'll see.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, William Casing, holding out we'll give you the hint that Gerald Ford might show up here tonight with Ronald Reagan and George Bush. Now over to Tom Brokaw.
Thank you very much, Derek. I'm here with Robert Ray, the governor of Iowa. Iowa, the first victory for George Bush, of course, during the primary season. It didn't work out quite the way he wanted it to during the primaries, but he ended up doing well here in the convention after a rather suspenseful last night. It was just about 24 hours ago that you and I were talking, and you were convinced at that time that you'd have different signs up here. They would say Reagan and Ford. Are you happier with that ticket than with this one?
Well, I can't say I'm happier. I'm very happy with this ticket. But at that moment, it really appeared that it was going to be a Reagan-Ford ticket. And we could have lived with that. It was intriguing. It was different. It was unique. But this is a good ticket. And when we came into this convention, we said if Bush is the choice for vice president, we'll have a real strong ticket. And we're going to have that kind of ticket.
Were you at all distressed by the way that situation was managed last night, Governor? Here you were told by several people very close to it that the deal had been struck. Were you distressed?
That doesn't really bother me because things like that happen. I think we probably have never come so close to having a different ticket and still having a change. But those are the fortunes of politics, and it's a good fortune for George Bush.
Governor, in Iowa this fall, what are the issues that are going to work best for this ticket? Well, I think that we're going to have to pause now because we're about to see a Ronald Reagan film. Not one of his old films. This is a campaign promotional film. Robert Ray of Iowa, thank you very much.
This is a 10-minute film on Guess Who?
He was a salesman who followed jobs that led the family from Tampico, Illinois, to Galesburg, and finally to Dixon. Here, the young boy grew into manhood. And it was here, in America's heartland, that he developed his deep sense of values. The Reagans were a thrifty, hard-working, close-knit family. Luxuries were few and hard to come by. But to young Ron, nicknamed Dutch by his dad, life in Illinois was a rich and happy time. Young Dutch always had to work for spending money and to help out his family. Of all the jobs he had, his favorite was lifeguarding at Lowell Park on the Rock River. After high school, Dutch Reagan landed a football scholarship from the school of his dreams, Eureka College in Eureka, Illinois, sister college of TCU, Texas Christian University. His great loves at Eureka were football, drama, swimming, and making friends on campus and with the people in town. He did what he had to do to make ends meet. Everything from washing dishes in a sorority house to coaching the swimming team after classes. Upon graduation, to pay off his student loans, Ron took a job as a sports announcer with a fledgling radio station in Davenport, Iowa, station WOC. His picturesque style of broadcasting let the listener see all the action. His reputation spread quickly, and he soon made the big time. Head sports announcer for WHO Radio in Des Moines, Iowa. Even today, there are a lot of people in the Midwest who remember Dutch Reagan as the voice of the mighty Chicago Cubs and the White Sox. One spring morning, announcer Reagan arrived in California to join the Cubs at their spring training camp. With a deep love for acting, the help of a friend, and a bit of good luck, he was soon offered a contract with Warner Brothers Studios. He became a star who appealed to audiences because he was so clearly one of them. Few knew it at the time, but he was also a peacetime volunteer Army officer. So with the outbreak of World War II, he put aside his career, signed on for active duty, and was transferred to a Special Air Force training film unit. 4 years later, Air Force Captain Reagan returned to Warner Brothers to resume his career. Little did he know that the most challenging period of his life lay just before him. Being a dedicated union man and tireless in his efforts to improve the lot of every working man and woman, he was 6 times elected president of the Screen Actors Guild of the AFL-CIO. As president of the union, Ron Reagan helped bring equity in salaries and working conditions for actors, technicians, extras, cameramen, almost everyone in the industry. More importantly, he single-handedly took on the job of keeping union members in control of the union and prevented a takeover of the film industry by organized crime. This crusade to preserve the freedom of America's working men and women kindled in Mr. Reagan a deep, abiding interest in the processes of our unique Republican form of government. He began to take an active interest in politics, both in California and on the national scene. He had been raised in a Democrat family by a fiercely independent father who was adamant in his love for freedom. In 1952 and 1956, following his own conscience and with a clear view of the dangers facing America, Ron Reagan volunteered as a Democrat for Eisenhower. In 1962, he officially joined the Republican Party. The rest is history. In 1966, answering the call of his party, he was elected governor of California. Next to president, the biggest job in the nation. More people live in California than any other state. It's the #1 producer of everything from farm goods to computer chips, generating 1 out of every $8 of production in this country. If California was a country, it would rank 8th in the world, nearly equaling the total GNP of the United Kingdom. What the new governor inherited was a state of crisis. California was faced with a $194 million deficit and was spending $1 million a day more than it was taking in. The state was on the brink of bankruptcy. Working with teams from all sectors, the unions, banking, agriculture, education, and industry, Governor Reagan got things back on track. His common sense style and strong creative leadership won him a second term in 1970, and he won by one of the biggest landslides in the history of the state. Governor Reagan became the greatest tax reformer in the state's history. His program included property tax relief of over $2 billion. He reduced sales taxes by over $300 million and gave tax rebates of almost $750 million. The San Francisco Chronicle said, "We exaggerate very little when we say that Governor Reagan has saved the state from bankruptcy." When Governor Reagan left office, the $194 million deficit had been transformed into a $554 million surplus. And while saving the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars, he improved the quality of life for the people of California. Scholarships for needy students were increased by 500%, student loans by over 900%. His environmental protection program was the nation's toughest. He increased unemployment insurance by almost 60%. The head of the AFL-CIO said this about Governor Reagan. Governor Reagan has signed AFL-CIO-backed bills for injured and unemployed workers for more than $266 million. No governor, Republican or Democrat, has ever done anything like that. The efficiency and remarkable effectiveness of the government of California under the leadership of Governor Reagan became a model for every state in the Union. This is a man whose time has come, a man whose principles have been familiar to Americans for 30 years, a man whose accomplishments make him the natural choice for President of the United States. A man who believes that the decline of America must be halted and can be halted. A man who rejects the concept of lowered expectations because he believes in the boundless opportunities of the American idea. A man who has prepared himself for strong, creative leadership. Through all the years, the outstanding characteristic of Ronald Reagan has been confidence. Confidence in the triumph of the principles he has consistently defended throughout his personal and political life. This is the man who believes our nation can regain the stature it has lost in the eyes of the world. This is the man who understands the principles that make America great. Above all, he believes in America and the kind of strong, creative leadership that can restore our faith in the future. He calls not for retreat into the past, but for a confident advance into the future. The day Ronald Reagan takes office as President of the United States will be the day when America comes together for a new beginning. Together, a new beginning.
And there you see the motorcade outside the hall of former President Gerald Ford, who will be coming in here in a few minutes. We can't tell exactly how long that will be. I'm pretty sure that's the Ford motorcade, because we've already seen the Reagan motorcade.
And the Bush motorcade, so who else is left?
Yes, that's it. The little sign says Ford motorcade. So running well ahead of schedule, David.
Which is remarkable. Almost never happens.
They are appointing
Robert Dole of
a
Kansas,
committee now.
Ben Fernandez of California.
They'll call an escort committee, and while they're doing that, we'll have
Guy
this.
Vanderjack of Michigan. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the moment we have all awaited.
Okay, there's Governor Reagan with the members of the escort committee.
very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. We're using up prime time. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. We're singing our song. Thank you very much. Thank you. You're singing our song. Well, the first thrill tonight was to find myself for the first time in a long time in a movie on prime time. But this, as you can imagine, is the second big thrill. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice President-to-be, this convention, my fellow citizens of this great nation, with a deep awareness of the responsibility conferred by your trust, I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States. I do so with deep gratitude, and I think also I might interject on behalf of all of us our thanks to Detroit and the people of Michigan and of this city for the warm hospitality we've enjoyed. And I thank you for your wholehearted response to my recommendation with regard to George Bush as the candidate for Vice President. I'm very proud of our party tonight. This convention has shown to all America a party united with positive programs for solving the nation's problems. A party ready to build a new consensus with all those across the land who share a community of values embodied in these words: family, work, neighborhood, peace, and freedom. Now, I know that we've had a quarrel or two, but as only as to the method of attaining a goal. There was no argument here about the goal. As president, I will establish a liaison with the 50 governors to encourage them to eliminate, wherever it exists, discrimination against women. I will
I will monitor federal laws to ensure their implementation and to add statutes if they are needed. More than anything else, I want my candidacy to unify our country, to renew the American spirit and sense of purpose. I want to carry our message to every American, regardless of party affiliation, who is a member of this community of shared values. Never before in our history have Americans been called upon to face three grave threats to our very existence, any one of which could destroy us. We face a disintegrating economy, a weakened defense, and an energy policy based on the sharing of scarcity. The major issue of this campaign is the direct political, personal, and moral responsibility of Democratic Party leadership in the White House and in the Congress for this unprecedented calamity which has befallen us. They tell us they've done the most that could humanly be done. They say that the United States has had its day in the sun, that our nation has passed its zenith. They expect you to tell your children that the American people no longer have the will to cope with their problems, that the future will be one of sacrifice and few opportunities. My fellow citizens, I utterly reject that view. The American people, the most generous on earth, who created the highest standard of living, are not going to accept the notion that we can only make a better world for others by moving backward ourselves. And those who believe we can have no business leading this nation. I will not stand by and watch this great country destroy itself under mediocre leadership that drifts from one crisis to the next, eroding our national will and purpose. We have come together here because the American people deserve better from those to whom they entrust our nation's highest offices. And we stand united. We stand united in our resolve to do something about it. We need a rebirth of the American tradition of leadership at every level of government and in private life as well. The United States of America is unique in world history because it has a genius for leaders, many leaders on many levels. But back in 1976, Mr. Carter said, "Trust me." And a lot of people did. And now many of those people are out of work. Many have seen their savings eaten away by inflation. Many others on fixed incomes, especially the elderly, have watched helplessly as the cruel tax of inflation wasted away their purchasing power. And today, a great many who trusted Mr. Carter wonder if we can survive the Carter policies of national defense. Trust Me government asks that we concentrate our hopes and dreams on one man, that we trust him to do what's best for us. Well, my view of government places trust not in one person or one party, but in those values that transcend persons and parties. The trust is where it belongs, in the people. The responsibility to live up to that trust is where it belongs, in their elected leaders. That kind of relationship between the people and their elected leaders is a special kind of compact. 360 years ago in 1620, a group of families dared to cross a mighty ocean to build a future for themselves in a new world. When they arrived at Plymouth, Massachusetts, they formed what they called a compact, an agreement among themselves to build a community and abide by its laws. This single act, the voluntary binding together of free people to live under the law, set the pattern for what was to come. A century and a half later, The descendants of those people pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to found this nation. Some forfeited their fortunes and their lives. None sacrificed honor. Fourscore and 7 years later, Abraham Lincoln called upon the people of all America to renew their dedication and their commitment to a government of, for, and by the people. Isn't it once again time to renew our compact of freedom? To pledge to each other all that is best in our lives, all that gives meaning to them for the sake of this our beloved and blessed land. Together, let us make this a new beginning. Let us make a commitment to care for the needy, to teach our children the virtues handed down to us by our families, to have the courage to defend those values and virtues and the willingness to sacrifice for them. Let us pledge to restore in our time the American spirit of voluntary service, of cooperation, of private and community initiative, a spirit that flows like a deep and mighty river through the history of our nation. As your nominee, I pledge to you to restore to the federal government the capacity to do the people's work without dominating their lives. I pledge to you a government that will not only work well, but wisely. Its ability to act tempered by prudence, and its willingness to do good, balanced by the knowledge that government is never more dangerous than when our desire to have it help us blinds us to its great power to harm us. You know, the first Republican president once said, while the people retain their virtue and their vigilance, no administration by any extreme of wickedness or folly can seriously injure the government in the short space of 4 years. If Mr. Lincoln could see what's happened in the last 3.5 years, he might hedge a little on that statement. But with the virtues that are our legacy as a free people, and with the vigilance that sustains liberty, we still have time to use our renewed compact to overcome the injuries that have been done to America these past 3.5 years. First, we must overcome something the present administration has cooked up, a new and altogether indigestible economic stew. 1 part inflation, 1 part high unemployment, 1 part recession, 1 part runaway taxes, 1 part deficit spending, seasoned with an energy crisis. It's an economic stew that has turned the national stomach. Ours are not problems of abstract economic theory. These are problems of flesh and blood, problems that cause pain and destroy the moral fiber of real people who should not suffer the further indignity of being told by the government that it is all somehow their fault. We do not have inflation because, as Mr. Carter says, we've lived too well. The head of a government which has utterly refused to live within its means and which has in the last few days told us that this coming year's deficit will be $60 billion, dares to point the finger of blame at business and labor, both of which have been engaged in a losing struggle just trying to stay even. High taxes, we are told, are somehow good for us, as if when government spends our money it isn't inflationary, but when we spend it, it is. Those who preside over the worst energy shortage in our history tell us to use less so that we'll run out of oil, gasoline, and natural gas a little more slowly. Well, now, conservation is desirable, of course. But we mustn't waste energy. But conservation is not the sole answer to our energy needs. America must get to work producing more energy. The Republican program for solving economic problems is based on growth and productivity. Large amounts of oil and natural gas lay beneath our land and off our shores untouched because the present administration seems to believe the American people would rather see more regulation, more taxes, and more controls than more energy. Coal offers a great potential. So does nuclear energy produced under rigorous safety standards. It could supply electricity for thousands of industry and millions of jobs and homes. It must not be thwarted by a tiny minority opposed to economic growth, which often finds friendly ears in regulatory agencies for its obstructionist campaigns. Now, make no mistake, we will not permit the safety of our people or our environmental heritage to be jeopardized. But we are going to reaffirm that the economic prosperity of our people is a fundamental part of our environment. Our problems are both acute and chronic. Yet all we hear from those in positions of leadership are the same tired proposals for more government tinkering, more meddling, and more control, all of which led us to this sorry state in the first place. Can anyone look at the record of this administration and say, well done? Can anyone compare the state of our economy when the Carter administration took office with where we are today and say, keep up the good work? Can anyone look at our reduced standing in the world today and say, let's have 4 more years of this? I believe the American people are going to answer these questions as you've answered them in the first week in November, and their answer will be, no, we've had enough. And then it will be up to us, beginning next January 20th, to offer an administration and congressional leadership of competence and more than a little courage. We must have the clarity of vision to see the difference between what is essential and what is merely desirable, and then the courage to bring our government back under control. It is essential. It is essential that we maintain both the forward momentum of economic growth and the strength of the safety net between those in our society who need help. We also believe it is essential that the integrity of all aspects of Social Security be preserved. Beyond these essentials, I believe it is clear our federal government is overgrown and overweight. Indeed, it is time our government should go on a diet. Therefore, my first act as chief executive will be to impose an immediate and thorough freeze on federal hiring. Then we're going to enlist the very best minds from business, labor, and whatever quarter to conduct a detailed review of every department, bureau, and agency that lives by federal appropriation. And we're going to enlist the help and ideas of many dedicated and hard-working government employees at all levels who want a more efficient government just as much as the rest of us do. I know that many of them are demoralized by the confusion and waste they confront in their work as a result of failed and failing policies. Our instructions to the groups we enlist will be simple and direct. We will remind them that government programs exist at the sufferance of the American taxpayer and are paid for with money earned by working men and women, and programs that represent a waste of their money, a theft from their pocketbooks, must have that waste eliminated or that program must go. It must go by executive order where possible, by congressional action where necessary. Everything that can be run more effectively by state and local government, we shall turn over to state and local government along with the funding sources to pay for it. We're going to put an end to the money merry-go-round where our money becomes Washington's money to be spent by states and cities exactly the way the federal bureaucrats tell us it has to be spent. I will not accept the excuse that the federal government has grown so big and powerful that it is beyond the control of any president, any administration, or Congress. We are going to put an end to the notion that the American taxpayer exists to fund the federal government. The federal government exists to serve the American people. On January 20th, we are going to reestablish that truth. Also on that date, we are going to initiate action to get substantial relief for our tax-paying citizens and action to put people back to work. None of this will be based on any new form of monetary tinkering or fiscal sleight of hand. We will simply apply to government the common sense that we all use in our daily lives. Work and family are at the center of our lives, the foundation of our dignity as a free people. When we deprive people of what they've earned or take away their jobs, we destroy their dignity and undermine their families. We can't support families unless there are jobs, and we can't have jobs unless the people have both money to invest and the faith to invest it. These are concepts that stem from an economic system that for more than 200 years has helped us master a continent, create a previously undreamed of prosperity for our people, and has fed millions of others around the globe. And that system will continue to serve us in the future if our government will stop ignoring the basic values on which it was built and stop betraying the trust and goodwill of the American workers who keep it going. The American people are carrying the heaviest peacetime tax burden in our nation's history, and it will grow even heavier under present law next January. We're taxing ourselves into economic exhaustion and stagnation, crushing our ability and incentive to save, invest, and produce. This must stop. We must halt this fiscal self-destruction and restore sanity to our economic system. I've long advocated a 30% reduction in income tax rates over a period of 3 years. This phased tax reduction would begin with a 10% down payment tax cut in 1981, which the Republicans in Congress and I have already proposed. A phased reduction of tax rates would go a long way toward easing the heavy burden on the American people, but we shouldn't stop there. Within the context of economic conditions and appropriate budget priorities, during each fiscal year of my presidency, I would strive to go further. This would include improvement in business depreciation taxes so we can stimulate investment in order to get plants and equipment replaced. Put more Americans back to work and put our nation back on the road to being competitive in world commerce. We will also work to reduce the cost of government as a percentage of our gross national product. The first task of national leadership is to set realistic and honest priorities in our policies and our budget. And I pledge that my administration will do that. When I talk of tax cuts, I'm reminded that every major tax cut in this century has strengthened the economy, generated renewed productivity, and ended up yielding new revenues for the government by creating new investment, new jobs, and more commerce among our people. The present administration has been forced by us Republicans to play follow the leader with regard to a tax cut. But in this election year, we must take with the proverbial grain of salt any tax cut proposed by those who have already given us the greatest single tax increase in our nation's history. When those in leadership give us tax increases and tell us we must also do with less, have they thought about those who've always had less, especially the minorities? This is like telling them that just as they step on that first rung of the ladder of opportunity, the ladder is being pulled out from under them. That may be the Democratic leadership's message to the minorities, but it won't be our message. Ours will be, we have to move ahead, but we're not going to leave anyone behind. Thanks to the economic policies of the Democratic Party, millions of Americans find themselves out of work. Millions more have never even had a fair chance to learn new skills, hold a decent job, or secure for themselves and their families a share in the prosperity of this nation. It's time to put America back to work, to make our cities and towns resound with the confident voices of men and women of all races, nationalities, and faiths, bringing home to their families a paycheck they can cash for honest money. For those without skills, we'll find a way to help them get new skills. For those without job opportunities, we'll stimulate new opportunities, particularly in the inner cities where they live. For those who've abandoned hope, we'll restore hope and we'll welcome them into a great national crusade to make America great again. When we move from domestic affairs and cast our eyes abroad, we see an equally sorry chapter in the record of the present administration. A Soviet combat brigade trains in Cuba just 90 miles from our shores. A Soviet army of invasion occupies Afghanistan, further threatening our vital interests in the Middle East. America's defense strength is at its lowest ebb in a generation, while the Soviet Union is vastly outspending us in both strategic and conventional arms. Our European allies, looking nervously at the growing menace from the East, turn to us for leadership and fail to find it. And incredibly, more than 50, as you've been told from this platform so eloquently already, more than 50 of our fellow Americans have been held captive for over 8 years, 8 months, by a dictatorial foreign power that holds us up to ridicule before the world. Adversaries large and small test our will and seek to confound our resolve. But we are given weakness when we need strength, vacillation when the times demand firmness. The Carter administration lives in a world of make-believe, every day drawing up a response to that day's troubles, regardless of what happened yesterday and what will happen tomorrow. But you and I live in a real world where disasters are overtaking our nation without any real response from Washington. This is make-believe, self-deceit, and above all, transparent hypocrisy. For example, Mr. Carter says he supports the volunteer army, but he lets military pay and benefits slip so low that many of our enlisted personnel are actually eligible for food stamps. Re-enlistment rates drop. And just recently, after he fought all week against a proposed pay increase for our men and women in the military, he then helicoptered out to the carrier, the USS Nimitz, which was returning from long months of duty in the Indian Ocean, and told the crew of that ship that he advocated better pay for them and their comrades. Where does he really stand now that he's back on shore? Well, I'll tell you where I stand. I do not favor a peacetime draft or registration, but I do favor pay and benefit levels that will attract and keep highly motivated men and women in our volunteer forces. And back them up with an active reserve, trained and ready for instant call in case of emergency. You know, there may be a sailor at the helm of the ship of state, but the ship has no rudder. Critical decisions are made at times almost in comic fashion, but who can laugh? Who was not embarrassed when the administration handed a major propaganda victory in the United Nations to the enemies of Israel, our staunch Middle East ally for 3 decades, and then claimed that the American vote was a mistake, the result of a failure of communication between the President, his Secretary of State, and his UN ambassador? Who does not feel a growing sense of unease as our allies, facing repeated instances of an amateurish and confused administration, reluctantly conclude that America is unwilling or unable to fulfill its obligations as leader of the free world? Who does not feel rising alarm when the question in any discussion of foreign policy is no longer should we do something, but do we have the capacity to do anything? The administration which has brought us to this state is seeking your endorsement for 4 more years of weakness, indecision, mediocrity, and incompetence. No American should vote until he or she has asked, is the United States stronger and more respected now than it was 3.5 years ago? Is the world safer? A safer place in which to live? It is the responsibility of the President of the United States in working for peace to ensure that the safety of our people cannot successfully be threatened by a hostile foreign power. As President, fulfilling that responsibility will be my #1 priority. We're not a warlike people, quite the opposite. We always seek to live in peace. We resort to force infrequently and with great reluctance, and only after we've determined that it's absolutely necessary. We are awed, and rightly so, by the forces of destruction at loose in the world in this nuclear era. But neither can we be naive or foolish. 4 times in my lifetime, America has gone to war, bleeding the lives of its young men into the sands of island beachheads, the fields of Europe, and the jungles and rice paddies of Asia. We know only too well that war comes not when the forces of freedom are strong. It is when they are weak that tyrants are tempted. We simply cannot learn these lessons the hard way again without risking our destruction. Of all the objectives we seek, first and foremost is the establishment of lasting world peace. We must always stand ready to negotiate in good faith, ready to pursue any reasonable avenue that holds forth the promise of lessening tensions and furthering the prospects of peace. But let our friends and those who may wish us ill take note. The United States has an obligation to its citizens and to the people of the world never to let those who would destroy freedom dictate the future course of life on this planet. I would regard my election as proof that we have renewed our resolve to preserve world peace and freedom, that this nation will once again be strong enough to do that. Now this evening marks the last step, save one, of a campaign that has taken Nancy and me from one end of this great nation to the other over many months and thousands of miles. There are those who question the way we choose a president, who say that our process imposes difficult and exhausting burdens on those who seek the office. I have not found it so. It's impossible to capture in words the splendor of this vast continent which God has granted as our portion of his creation. There are no words to express the extraordinary strength and character of this breed of people we call American. Everywhere we've met thousands of Democrats, independents, and Republicans from all economic conditions, all walks of life, bound together in that community of shared values of family, work, neighborhood, peace, and freedom. They're concerned, yes. They're not frightened. They're disturbed, but not dismayed. They are the kind of men and women Tom Paine had in mind when he wrote during the darkest days of the American Revolution, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." Nearly 150 years after Tom Paine wrote those words, An American president told the generation of the Great Depression that it had a rendezvous with destiny. I believe this generation of Americans today also has a rendezvous with destiny. Tonight, let us dedicate ourselves to renewing the American compact. I ask you not simply to trust me, but to trust your values, our values, and to hold me responsible for living up to them. I ask you to trust that American spirit, which knows no ethnic, religious, social, political, regional, or economic boundaries. The spirit that burned with zeal in the hearts of millions of immigrants from every corner of the earth who came here in search of freedom. Some say that spirit no longer exists, but I've seen it. I've felt it all across this land, in the big cities, the small towns, and in rural America. It's still there, ready to blaze into life if you and I are willing to do what has to be done. We have to do the practical things, the down-to-earth things such as creating policies that will stimulate our economy, increase productivity, and put America back to work. The time is now to limit federal spending, to insist on a stable monetary reform, and to free ourselves from imported oil. The time is now to resolve that the basis of a firm and principled foreign policy is one that takes the world as it is and seeks to change it by leadership and example, not by harangue, harassment, or wishful thinking. The time now is now. The time is now to say that we shall seek new friendships and expand others and improve others, but we shall not do so by breaking our word or casting aside old friends and allies. And the time is now to redeem promises once made to the American people by another candidate in another time and another place. He said, for 3 long years, I have been going up and down this country preaching that government, federal, state, and local, costs too much. I shall not stop that preaching. As an immediate program of action, we must abolish useless offices. We must eliminate unnecessary functions of government. We must consolidate subdivisions of government and, like the private citizen, give up luxuries which we can no longer afford. And then he said, I propose to you, my friends, and through you, that government of all kinds, big and little, be made solvent, and that the example be set by the President of the United States and his cabinet. End of quote. That was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's words as he accepted the Democratic nomination for president in 1932. The time is now, my fellow Americans, to recapture our destiny, to take it into our own hands. And to do this, will take many of us working together. I ask you tonight, all over this land, to volunteer your help in this cause so that we can carry our message throughout the land. Isn't it time that we, the people, carry out those unkept promises that we pledged to each other and to all America on this July day, 48 years later, that now we intend to do just that? I have thought of something that's not a part of my speech and worried over whether I should do it. Can we doubt that only a divine providence placed this land, this island of freedom, here is a refuge for all those people in the world who yearn to breathe free. Jews and Christians enduring persecution behind the Iron Curtain, the boat people of Southeast Asia, of Cuba, and of Haiti, the victims of drought and famine in Africa, the freedom fighters in Afghanistan, and our own countrymen held in savage captivity. I'll confess that I've been a little afraid to suggest what I'm going to suggest. I'm more afraid not to. Can we begin our crusade, join together in a moment of silent prayer? God bless America. Thank you.
It's done. They'll be going along like this for some time, and we'll have more of it after this.
And Gerald Ford. He was sitting in a box in the hall during the speech. He and Mrs. Ford walked over to the podium when it was finished. Mrs. Ford, Mrs. Reagan. Print shop worked all night making those Reagan-Bush signs.
The order came late.
Gary Gudley is talking to the organizer of this demonstration, which I must say does not look terribly organized, except for the balloons, all of which fell on cue. Garrick, if you can hear me, we'd like to hear you.
Well, David, this is Bill Brennan, a political Pied Piper. In real life, as if this is not real life, he's an attorney in San Diego, but he's a traffic cop here trying to organize this demonstration. Mr. Brennan, how's it going?
Oh, we're having a lot of fun down here, that's for sure.
Now, what's the secret to keeping this thing going now?
A lot of enthusiasm and being a big boy at heart, I would imagine.
But you have to get the flow going. You're talking about the flow. What does that mean? You have to keep people moving so you don't have traffic jams?
We're interested, a lot of movement, a lot of enthusiasm, and people can dance in their seats for all we care.
How long is this supposed to go? About 15 minutes? Would you like to make it go longer?
Hopefully we'd like to go 15 minutes. I think we'll go more than 20, though. The crowd is really a great one.
How do you judge how it's going? Do you sense the adrenaline? Can you measure
We only do this once every 4 years. I'm not sure.
Well, let's watch you work, okay? Get back to work.
Thank you. Bring him down. Come on down here. Let's go. Come on.
grandchildren. number of the people who are down there in the audience are not delegates and they're not alternates. They're wearing badges which say demonstrator.
Well, it's a badge of office, a statement of purpose. I didn't see them doing tonight what they have done at times in the past, and that is to bring in outsiders. People hired outside. Do you suppose demonstrators are hired and brought in for this?
I don't think they're hired. I just think they're recruited. They're not paid.
Well, some have been. I don't know about these.
I don't think here. I don't know. Well, I have a correction to make. I said that was one of the Bush grandchildren. It is a Reagan grandchild.
We'll be back in a moment.
Nabisco gives rise to a remarkable cracker. New Wheatsworth Stone Ground Crackers.
Stone ground wheat flour with a touch of sesame make a delicate taste with a difference.
Try Wheatsworth with soup, Wheatsworth with salad, Wheatsworth with cheese.
A delicate taste with a difference.
Wheatsworth Stone Ground Crackers, new from Nabisco.
Mr. Chairman! Yes? The delegate from New York Life wishes to...
Did the delegate say New York Life?
Yes, sir, and we...
What has New York Life got to do?
Mr. Chairman, since 1845, our company has insured 11 American presidents. 7 in this century.
Order, sir. Life insurance is a personal matter.
It's a family matter, and we vote for the candidates who choose New York Life for family protection.
Can they do that?
Convention Moments. Edwin Newman footnotes the Republican Convention of 1976. Brought to you by the Bell System Yellow Pages. The first step, let your fingers do the walking through the Bell System Yellow Pages.
The Republican Party that met in Kansas City 4 years ago was reeling from Watergate and split by the challenge of Ronald Reagan to President Gerald Ford. Both men came to Kansas City early in pursuit of delegates, but the presidential roll call was an anticlimax. The nomination was decided on the issue of requiring presidential candidates to name their vice presidential choices before the balloting began. Reagan had already named Senator Richard Schweiker of Pennsylvania. Ford was opposed. Mississippi, the key delegation, sided with Ford.
Mississippi, cast 30 votes no.
The Reagan proposal was defeated by 111 votes. And Reagan was defeated the next night by 117 votes on the first presidential roll call. Edwin Newman, NBC News.
Some house, but you need a new heating system.
Gas is nice.
We heard wood stoves were efficient. Wood's not cheap.
There's oil. Cammy is a fireplace.
How about steam? You gotta have insulation.
I know electric.
Hold it, hold it.
Solar heat.
Hold it. The first step is the Yellow Pages.
The Bell System Yellow Pages. The first step in helping you solve a heating problem. Before you waste time and money, take the first step. Let your fingers do the walking through the Bell System Yellow Pages. Some storm.
The house is cozy.
Which flood in upon us and demand
the convention, it's now benediction time at the convention.
Give each of us the courage of our convictions to know that we have some of the answers. Guide us in our finding more of the answers. And now may the prayer of St. Francis be our prayer. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love, For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. And now may the peace of God go with you all. Amen.
Will you please stay in your places while the Reagan family and the Bush family depart the auditorium?
Very much. Thank you all. Yes, it is. This is, I don't know what you say about a moment like this, or a moment that you never could have dreamed throughout most of your life that there would ever be anything like this in your life. But the honest approval and acceptance by these people out here is an experience that I'll remember always.
You used the word crusade.
Yes.
And I guess that's what you meant, isn't it?
Yes, I do. Yes.
What made you decide to offer that moment of silent prayer?
Well, as I said, I was more afraid not to.
I assume that you and President Ford are no longer in disagreement on where he ought to be in the campaign.
No, he made that decision, and he believes, and he has sworn to me and pledged his all-out support in the campaign, and believes that he could be more effective this way than he could on the ticket.
Do you expect the Democrats to make this a rough campaign on you?
What?
Do you expect the Democrats to make this a rough campaign?
I think there are indications of that, yes.
What are you going to do about it?
Well, I'm just going to keep on doing what I've been doing, criticizing what I think are the wrong policies and advocating other ones, and see what happens.
I guess for a sports announcer, it's a long way to being presidential candidate, isn't it?
It sure beats any homecoming game I ever broadcast.
Thank you very much, Governor. Now, if Mrs. Reagan perhaps could say a word or two. Ed, is Mrs. Reagan, Ed, could Mrs. Reagan just say something?
And you will go home and make sure.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
This is quite a moment for you.
Yes.
It started
I'm
when?
numb.
Are you?
Yes.
With pride, however, I suspect.
Well, of course.
All this started about
I always shed tears.
This all started about 16 years ago or so, didn't
You
it?
have a long memory, Tom.
Yes. And you've been running a long time and holding office part of the time. What kind of first lady do you think you would be if the election goes your way?
Oh, Tom, don't ask me that now. I'll be me.
Okay, we'll just thank you then.
Thank you.
All right, that is Mrs. Nancy Reagan. And now back to the booth.
That's the motion to adjourn.
Motion is agreed to. Having completed our business, I declare that the 32nd National Convention of the Republican Party is now adjourned, sine die. God bless you.
Well, they're playing the theme song for the 32nd Republican Convention. Jessica Savage with Mr. and Mrs. Ford.
Yes, I'm here with the Fords right now. I was asking them at this point, what are your thoughts? Would you tell me, Mr. President?
Well, Betty and I are very, very happy. We're proud of what the Republican convention did in nominating Governor Reagan and George Bush. We are very pleased with everything we've seen and heard, and we're very supportive, and it's just great.
There was a lot of last-minute dissension. How did you handle that? It's all over. What are your plans from here?
It's great to be here. We had a great time. We're proud of what the convention did, and, well, we just enjoyed it.
Mr. President, you know that people are saying man cannot live by golf alone.
I'm going to do a lot of things.
What political things? Any political things?
Ron,
Will you campaign for the governor?
good luck and God bless you. We'll be around. Thank you very much. Okay. Nancy, very best to you. You know we'll be there helping, assisting, and anything you want to ask, you let us know.
Thank you.
We'll be there.
Thank you.
particularly like the end. I like the total sincerity of the way he decided to bring it to a close.
That's
It just
George
had a good
Bush's
feeling.
voice.
The evening had a good feel. All this talk about united, but you could feel something strongly.
What did you feel? Was it spiritual?
I feel it was united and strong and together. We view this as a very serious effort to make a real change for this country. And I've been to a lot of conventions, and I really felt that it came together, and I think that governor's speech brought it together. And I felt good. I felt relaxed. I felt sincere. As I listened to his speech, I felt a sincere sense about this unity thing. Everybody talks about it, but it's out there. You go back in history and take a look at these.
Do you think that the Democrats are really going to rally behind that cry, being reminded of Franklin Roosevelt? Are minorities going to come to you?
Well, they're sure not going to go to Jimmy Carter. They've sure been overpromised and dealt out, and so it's wide open. We got to work hard. We got to reach out. But I like the idea that we're prepared to do it. I think we're being thrown out, speaking of reaching out, so we better go.
Do you think this campaign now has momentum?
We'd better ask Governor Reagan.
Okay, thank you very much. George Bush, the Republican vice presidential nominee. This is Tom Pettit on the podium.
There are more reporters on the podium now than there are candidates and candidates' families. One of the happiest people down there is Gerald Ford. He said he came here to Detroit to get George Bush on the ticket with Reagan, and he's leaving Detroit, and George Bush is on the ticket with Reagan. We'll have the final formalities after this. It seems longer than just 3 days ago when there was dissent here about the platform, some of it led by Senator Charles Percy of Illinois, who's with Tom Brokaw on the floor now.
Senator Percy, John Chancellor was saying that it seems longer ago than 3 days that you were leading a kind of small uprising here on the floor about one plank in the platform, at least, having to do with the appointment of federal judges. How do you feel about this ticket and the Republican chances this fall now on this evening?
Well, I think on that particular battle we've won it, really, because I don't think, as I've been assured by the platform, many members of the platform committee, they'll never try to put a plank like that in the platform again and politicize the judiciary system. Having had that assurance, I now feel extraordinarily comfortable about the ticket, and certainly the reach out for Ford and then to put George Bush on, I think was great. You'd had to have been on the floor here to feel emotion. God bless America. And certainly the hope and inspiration that we trust that can be brought to this country and the free world. It's a great hope and a prayer, and we're going to work awfully hard to make it a reality.
Senator Charles Percy, Republican of Illinois, now to Chris Wallace over in the Iowa section.
Women's rights was one of the big issues of this convention, and Mary Louise Smith of Iowa was one of the leaders on that issue, fighting for the ERA. She didn't get it into the platform. One of the first things that Ronald Reagan talked about tonight was women's rights. What did you think of what he had to say?
Oh, indeed, it was one of the very first thing, and it was very gratifying. We were hoping that he would mention it and show that kind of sensitivity to the issue. I think the signal last night came from his naming George Bush as a vice president who has been in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment, and certainly the next important signal came tonight, and I must tell you I'm very pleased.
Mary Louise Smith, thank you. Now to David Brinkley.
We're on NBC's no doubt famous balcony for the last time, I regret to say, Teddy, with Theodore White. Teddy White, our old friend, longtime compatriot. Teddy, you know, you can stand here, look at the crowd, the Republicans, and hear what they do, and see the increasingly Western orientation of the Republican Party.
That began in 1964 with the Barry Goldwater raid out of the Southwest. This speech, though, is very, very different from the Barry Goldwater speech. Goldwater's was certainly the most eloquent speech, one of the most eloquent speeches of acceptance I've heard, including Adlai Stevenson's and George McGovern's and several others. and Jerry Ford's. All the eloquent speeches are losers. That he just gave a very...
Hold on. All the eloquent speeches?
The most eloquent speech in any are losing speeches. The only time
Goldwater, Adlai Stevenson.
Richard Nixon in 1960, as against John F. Kennedy, who gave one of the poorest speeches of his life. Jerry Ford against Jimmy Carter. Jerry Ford gave a great speech. McGovern against Nixon in 72. Again, a classy speech. Humphrey's St. Francis of Assisi speech was a classic in Chicago. Only Nixon won that election, too. But tonight's speech is a hard-line, hard-nosed, tough, serious speech with a very little wit and very little eloquence. That speech was carpentered to do certain things. The out party always has the advantage of the attack. And they flayed Jimmy Carter at every point, or at least Ronald Reagan did. He gave it a theme. He calls it A New Beginning. Underneath the theme was the theme of unity. And that made me rather melancholy, because we've been hearing now ever since 1968, bring us together by Nixon, trust, said Hubert Humphrey and Muskie, come home again, said McGovern, all of them, trust me, said Jimmy Carter. They all preach the same thing, as if America were a disunited country, and that only this party can bring it together again. Look down there, and that says, together, a new beginning. We've heard that promise now, ever since Deschler, Ohio, in 1968.
A little girl held up the sign to Nixon at the railroad track.
That's right, that's right. What would...
Go ahead.
No, I just hope one of these candidates can do that job of bringing us together.
Well, in the case of the Republicans in this year, 1980, they have applied a special meaning to it in that they want to expand the party and bring people of like minds together to vote for Reagan.
Yes, it's a very carefully carpentered thing. That's what you say, and it's true. But of the five main...
I appreciate that, Teddy.
No, sir, that's what you say, and it is true. But when they say peace, family, jobs, neighborhoods, he means that busing has been a failure, and he wants schools to go back to local community control without the OEEC butting in. He means bring us together as groups and communities rather than living perhaps side by side.
Teddy, thank you very much. We'll see you in Madison Square Garden in New York in August. John?
We're getting ready now to talk to the floor reporters, which is our habit here at these conventions. And while they're assembling and doing some more work down on the floor, we'll have this.
The Republican convention is over. They did everything they came here to do. They nominated Reagan, and they nominated Bush after having certain difficulties about it, well detailed here last night and today. Now, tomorrow, Friday, Bush and Reagan will stay here in Detroit for a while, have some meetings, and then they will leave here and fly to Houston, Texas, which is Bush's hometown, and start the first rally of their campaign. Bush's schedule calls for him to remain here through Friday. Reagan then will go to California. Bush, I believe, will go to Maine, and they will both have a few days off, probably for the last time, until November. John, go on the balcony?
I'm on the balcony. Marvin Kalb of NBC News and I have been looking at the speech that Ronald Reagan gave tonight. Marvin, I want to ask you a question about one sentence in it that I underlined. He said, the United States has an obligation to its citizens and to the people of the world never to let those who would destroy freedom dictate the future course of human life on this planet.
John, I have the impression that just as Reagan is calling for some kind of crusade nationally, he is calling for a crusade in a way internationally as well. If you build up America's defense, if you pump in what may be $100 billion more in increased defense spending over the next 5 years, the idea is that on the basis of that kind of military strength, you can build peace throughout the world. Somehow or another, by attacking the Carter administration as he did for incompetence and deceit and what have you, he is clearly kicking off the beginnings of a campaign issue on foreign policy, which will probably get pretty nasty before the next 3 or 4 months are gone. And I have the distinct impression on the basis of this, on the basis of the platform, all of this is going to be read, every single word, by foreign ministries and journalists and diplomats around the world. And on the basis of this and the platform, they will get an impression that if this man is elected, with the increase in defense spending, there will be a more aggressive American foreign policy. How that turns to peace, I don't know, but that is clearly what's going to happen.
Hold on just there a second, would you, Marvin? The Reagans have just left the hall. You can see it on the monitor there.
Yeah.
And they'll be going back to their hotel. The convention ended 58 minutes early, so they've got a longer evening ahead of them than they might have thought. And there they are, just getting in and moving away. Well, as we watch these pictures, Marvin, Governor Reagan, to the degree that he is known by foreign governments, is regarded as pretty much of a hawk, isn't he?
Well, it was interesting that over the last couple of days in checking with diplomats and reporters, you do very much get that impression. But at the same time, there is a debate as to whether this kind of a hardline approach towards the Russians may be something that the Russians in fact want, though their propaganda line at this point is predictably very negative. They have been very unhappy with the Carter administration, believing that the unpredictability of President Carter is something that they in fact fear, and that if you can base your policy upon the expectation of a hard line, you can adjust your policy to that and perhaps head off the kind of problems that we have faced in different parts of the world. That's the theory, in any case.
I just go back to this sentence about the United States has an obligation to its citizens and the people of the world never to let those who would destroy freedom dictate the future course of human life on this planet. You remember 1960 and the Kennedy inaugural? We will go
Yes, indeed, anywhere and do everything.
And do everything.
Well, there is some of that. I suppose that there is this cyclical thing that if you had it in 60, you may get it 20 years later. But the world is so infinitely more complex at this time that the same formulas, while they are politically attractive and terribly commercial, they really are not necessarily formulas for solving any of the world's problems. That is a totally different kind of thing. There are no initiatives in this speech. There's no sense of how, in particular problem areas, he would handle something. You have no sense of the Middle East, of dealings with the Russians. You have only a crusade, an international one.
Well, in fact, the speech in general was not what we call a shopping list speech, though. I mean, I've heard Governor Reagan, and so have you, so many times list specifics and give a lot of facts and data to go with his conclusions. I thought domestically there were some initiatives, but generally it was just a statement more of beliefs than programs.
Of philosophy. There was, I was told anyway, something of a debate within the Reagan inner councils as to whether they could really outline specifics. But they obviously decided that they're not going to do that. And so they did have this philosophy, and that is clearly what he thought that everybody here wanted to hear.
Yes, sir. Well, interesting speech, interesting night, and if he wins, an interesting administration.
Indeed.
We'll see. He may not win. Thank you, Marvin. David?
John, Marvin, thank you. We'll have a final word with our correspondents on the floor in a moment. A little earlier, I reported here that Ronald Reagan this afternoon went out into Detroit's suburbs to the house of a friend of his to rehearse his speech. And I apparently gave the wrong suburb because I've just been handed a message. It said several viewers have called the news desk to report that Reagan rehearsed his speech in the suburb of Bloomfield Hills, not Grosse Pointe. One of these callers noted, with some edge in his voice, quote, "We in Grosse Pointe do not associate ourselves with Bloomfield Hills, so please have Mr. Brinkley make a correction." We'll be back in a moment.
Well, it's time for the fearless foursome on the floor, if they are assembled down there, for our traditional end of the convention talk, which we've been doing for years here at NBC, letting people say pretty much what they think instead of what they have just learned. Presuming that these four men can think, and I think they've demonstrated that, David, during
You mean
this
that they
convention.
still can after the beating
Still
they've
can
taken
after
here
the
in
beating.
4
Garrick
days?
Utley, I think, begins. Garrick?
I think, yes. I think, first of all, that the fact that this convention session ended about 1 hour early tonight speaks well, or hopefully, the Reagan campaign this fall, which starts only 6 weeks after their troubles yesterday. They seem to have got their organizational act in order, and this one even ahead of schedule. More seriously, as far as Reagan's acceptance speech tonight, it was a wonderful speech, well delivered, but it was a political stump speech, and I don't think we should over-scrutinize every line or every verb and apostrophe in that speech. Kennedy 20 years ago did say, yes, the torch was being passed to a new generation. We ended up in Vietnam and a lot of urban and racial unrest. Ronald Reagan speaks about his crusades, almost giving the hope or the thought that a man, an administration, can change the current of history. But as I was listening to down here on the floor in the crowd, I felt, yes, we'd like to believe that, but in the end, events are controlling men more than men are controlling events, or at least as far as we speak of the president, the man in the White House. And if Ronald Reagan's elected, no matter what he said tonight, he is going to have to face these same currents of history, and it's going to be very hard to carry some kind of emotional crusade against it. But I think the emotional impact was there tonight, and that, after all, is what an acceptance speech is all about. Chris?
This was really, it seemed to me, the night when the Republican convention worked the way that Ronald Reagan wanted it to work. They were very upset on Tuesday night when they went well past midnight and had to actually cancel or postpone the keynote address. And then, of course, everybody was upset in the Reagan campaign about the turmoil of yesterday. Tonight, everything went on and off on time, and they seemed very concerned about that, as if you can run a convention on schedule, you can run a country. And Reagan did hit all of the key points he wanted to hit in his acceptance speech. He very consciously reached out to blacks and to women. He very consciously said that he is not an ideologue, he's not a warmonger. He really made the points he wanted to make, and I think the Reagan people felt, that he had made a successful appeal to the independents and Democrats that he's going to need if he's going to have the chance to govern the country come next year.
And without being histrionic, he hit on those very issues that have served him so well, and without getting into specifics during this primary. The growth of government. He said there would be a freeze. He talked about the tax cut. But I guess most important of all, what he did was offer hope as a kind of counterpoint to administration that is now saying that there are so many problems that it's very hard to deal with them. And a year ago, an administration that was saying that America has lost confidence in itself and that we have a malaise in the land. And what he was saying is that that's not true, that we can go on to, indeed, this crusade. And you notice the tone of his voice. He didn't reach out and play the audience or overplay it. It was a well-modulated tone for a man who knows how to do that extremely well. As for the convention itself, I guess it reminds me of a car that starts off on a very smooth trip, well planned, everything is going well, and last night it hit a patch of ice, and it began to veer a little bit out of control. And they finally got it back under control, and they're back on the road again, and we don't think that there was any damage to the structure of the car, but we'll have to wait and find out how that works. How do you like that for a metaphor, Pettit?
That's all right. I don't pretend to understand what has happened here this week. It's a very difficult political, psychological process that's occurred. Yesterday, the situation existed in which the most interesting political activity I've seen or heard about in years occurred outside the convention hall. What went on inside the hall was nothing. All the activity was outside. I don't understand that, and I don't understand fully the crusade that Reagan began here tonight. I was on the podium and talking to him after he spoke, and he was moved to the point of being choked up at the conclusion of his moment of silent prayer. And he expressed the conviction that he had come very far in his life to win this Republican nomination. And it seemed to me that that perhaps is part of the psychology of Ronald Reagan, is that, as Richard Nixon wrote in his own autobiography, for a boy from a small town, I have now come farther than I had ever expected to come. So getting the nomination is a very large thing for Ronald Reagan. The speech was interesting. #1 in the world. That sort of symbolized what the Reagan campaign, or crusade as he calls it, is all about, in my opinion. And that is a return to a world situation of about 1946, prior to the Soviet development of the hydrogen bomb, when the United States had clear superiority over every nation in the world, including the Soviet Union, and the buck was worth a buck. Now, that's what the Reagan campaign, in my opinion, is about.
Thank you, gentlemen. I also want to thank you, and David joins me, in a very good job under quite difficult circumstances. I thought a superior job.
I thought you were excellent, all of you.
Thank you.
Particularly last night when none of you was taken in by that story about the Ford deal having been made. I think you were alone in not being taken in by it. I thought it was terrific, and you're the four best.
I have 2 cents worth that occurred to me. Governor Reagan ended his speech with the 1932 speech of Franklin Roosevelt, a famous speech in which Franklin Roosevelt talked about cutting down government offices, as he put it, cutting down the size of government. It's somehow ironic to me that Ronald Reagan would use that particular example because Franklin Roosevelt, as we all knew, oversaw the greatest expansion of federal power in the country's history, and I found it unusual at the end of Reagan's speech. David?
It was a strange ending for a Republican speech to use quotes from a speech by Roosevelt, which he used strictly to get elected. And the best scholars of the period think he never had any idea of doing that in the first place. Political speech to attract votes. Why people in the Depression, depths of the Depression in 1933 or 32, were so concerned about government being cut when in those days it didn't amount to anything anyway, I've always wondered. I may never know. We'll have a few more smart alecky remarks here in a minute, and we'll be back. 2 or 3 small points to make here. One is that it was notable that during 4 days of oratory and conversation, we never heard Richard Milhous Nixon's name mentioned once. Another is that, in my opinion, and I think John would agree, Detroit has done a splendid job being a host city to the convention. People here have been extremely friendly, helpful, and in general, it has worked. And we have seen tonight the beginning of the 1980 campaign. All these people in the hall, political activists, will now go out to work for the Reagan ticket and the Democrats later. They will all go out to fundraisers and cocktail parties and chicken dinners and this and that. Chicken and peas. It's kind of unsettling to contemplate how many chickens have laid down their lives in the service of American politics. That's about all I have to say, John.
When David leaves the booth here, he's going to the Detroit Plaza Hotel to have his picture taken with Ronald Reagan. Actually, a cardboard cutout of Ronald Reagan. They have it in the lobby, and you can pay $5 and have your picture taken with it. A young girl in the middle of a demonstration here tonight held up a sign, and it said, "Mom, send money." We can understand that. We're going to show you the names now of the people who really made this possible. We have fun and sit here, and we are supported by an incredibly agile, intelligent, wonderful crew of all kinds of people, and we are terribly grateful to them, and we'd like to show you their names now. Quite a bunch. Here they are.
They're all great.